Right. Well, personally, like you get caught behind a school bus or dump truck.
But we stopped too.
Good morning, everybody. Out of respect for everybody's time, we're going to go ahead and get started. I imagine there could be a few people joining us online as we move along. But want to welcome everybody. Thank you all for being here in person and for signing in to participate on this morning's Missouri Commission on Autism meeting. So as you know, we plan to spend 4 hours today both reviewing what has been submitted in terms of our phase 1 process for transition and discussing the phase 2 process, which has to do with early childhood and early intervention. So we have a fair number of things to do. As always, I like to begin, if people don't mind, just by going quickly around the room, people introducing themselves and giving their background in terms of why they're here. Remember, ground rules are we're all respectful of each other. We stay on a first name basis around here as much as possible, and want to encourage conversation, questions, comments, so that it really reflects a group effort. So that being said, I think I'll start in the room and just ask people to go around. We always have a few new folks joining, and so it's usually advantageous for everybody to just remind the others who they are. So Carrie, would you mind beginning, please?
So I'm Carrie Tessero. I'm the Assistant Director for the Department of Mental Health. And previously before that, I had Kristen's job as the Director of Autism Services.
And when you speak, please turn on your mic so that the people on the video
I should know better.
can hear you.
And I forgot. So for those on the line, Carrie Tessero, Assistant Director for Department of Mental Health. And prior to that, I was the Director of the Office of Autism Services.
Thank you.
I'm Shayla Mendy. I am a special education coach and autism consultant for Park Hill School District in the Kansas City area.
Luke Daly, I'm with Vocational Rehabilitation.
Dale Stone, parent of an adult son with autism.
Good morning. I'm Jeannie Marshall. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer for Easter Seals Midwest, and I'm providing input on behalf of MARF. I'm sorry, which is providers across the state.
Hi, my name is Lindsay Athamana. I'm an assistant professor over at the University of Missouri, St. Louis.
Good morning. I'm Johanna Visches. I'm a clinical coordinator with Division of Youth Services, and I'm the representative for Department of Social Services.
Good morning. I'm Carrie Couch. I'm the Director of the Consumer Affairs Division at the Department of Commerce and Insurance.
Seth Allen, I'm the Director of the Autism Center and Autism Services at Rural Behavioral Health, centered out of Springfield.
I'm Tim Digon, Executive Vice President with the Arc of the Ozarks.
I'm John Manavani. I'm a child neurologist and medical director at Mercy Kids Autism Center in St. Louis.
I'm Kristen Morgan, Director of the Office of Autism Services for Department of Mental Health.
And then the people online, will they please also, if you have a video, show your face and introduce yourself. Catherine, can we start with you, please?
Catherine Pigg, Office of Autism Services. I have a new computer and my video's not working.
Thank you. Summer?
Hi, I'm Summer Bridges. I'm on the Parent Advisory Council for Southeast Missouri, and Missouri just newly got on that board, and I'm a parent of a child with autism.
Loretta?
Loretta Fuge, I'm a psychologist in Mansfield.
Paula?
Still muted, Paula. Oh, Paula, you're on mute.
I think you're still muted, Paula.
I apologize. I'm Paula Dar. I'm the Associate Chief with the Bureau of Special Healthcare Needs in Department of Health and Senior Services.
Spencer?
Hello, I'm Spencer Hundley, autistic professional based in Kansas City, Missouri, on the executive committee of the Kansas City League of Autistics and undergrad at psychology at UMKC.
and Kristen Soul.
Hey everybody, it's Kristen Soul, pediatrician at the University of Missouri. Really excited to be here. Sorry I can't be in person, but hopefully I'll be able to listen and contribute where I can. Good to see you.
So again, thanks to everybody for participating this morning. Our first agenda item, this is an odd way to do this. I've never done anything exactly like this before, but that would speak to this entire year. So the issue with regard to how you take a group document, organize it, edit it, and then bring it back to the group for comment, particularly whenever you'd like to achieve a timely report, as we've been requested to do, has been an interesting challenge. So what I've elected to do, and it's strictly arbitrary, is, and I apologize that the document did not get to you all with much time in between. There was a fair amount of 11th hour work, as you might imagine, to get it to you when we did. So I feel proud of the accomplishment, but we're not trying to rush people or to railroad anything through without folks having the time to give it due consideration. I will submit with the prerogative of the chair that the discussion of this document is not with regard to its editing, punctuation, or grammar. We're here to talk about the ideas that are presented in the document and to be sure that the various constituencies have been fairly represented and that the work groups feel that their recommendations have been honored and placed in the document in an appropriate way. So I want to certainly encourage any discussion or questions or corrections if something has been missed. That's an important thing. And this is our one time as a group to really feel free about stepping out in front and saying, well, I have a problem with the way this is, with this particular recommendation because I think it omitted some opportunities and here's what those opportunities are. So if we can try to keep the discussion at that level, I think that would be useful. What I suggest we do, first of all, let me see if there's any questions or comments about that. Is that acceptable overall to people in terms of giving you a chance to comment on the document? First of all, how many people are, let me put it this way, I think I have to do it the other way. How many people have had the opportunity to review the document? So
Portions.
pardon me?
Portions.
Portions, and hopefully the portions that were most relevant to you and your work group are those. Yes, hopefully. Okay. So I saw most people in the room, if not everyone. Dr. Souls nodding her head. Yes.
I've reviewed, but really only the portion that I helped with, and I really feel like I need to look at the others, but I haven't gotten there yet.
Yeah, fair enough. I suspect that's what a lot of folks did. Who has, somebody have their hand up, or is that a comment from Catherine? What am I looking at over there?
Oh, that's just that it's recording.
Okay. So let's do this if it's okay as a starting point. Let's go to page 11, which is recommendations. So there's a lot of background discussion in each of the domains and generally as well. But the thing that I think we really want to be as focused on as we can is that the recommendations, both the general and the specific domain recommendations, reflect the commission's views on what ought to be priorities. So if we look at, do you all have the document in front of you? Does everybody have it? Yes. Okay, great. So if we look at general recommendations, you'll see that there are 4 of those. The first one relates to the development of a centralized state-supported autism and disability resource repository like those that exist in other states. And if you'll recall, we had some robust discussion here at one of the previous meetings, specifically reflecting, I think, on the Minnesota's Autism Resource Portal, which served as a model in terms of a broad range of information that can be accessed. It's a big project, it's a big repository, but that clearly did come through as a recommendation. And so the concept of this is a single site that likely has multiple access points through various constituencies in the state level and beyond, that directs individuals and families involved in the transition process, but not limited to transition, although we're focusing on that today. To focus on at least the 6 domains that we have focused on in terms of this commission, that it needs to be a single entry point, that it should be tied hopefully to projects like the No Wrong Door project, which is just really moving along nationally, and I think Missouri now is on board, as I understand. The site needs to be user-friendly, and it needs to have materials at appropriate levels of health literacy in varied languages, etc. This is a big project. That's why it's the first recommendation, recognizing that this would require a lot of effort and organizational skills, and that the commission is really not in a position to be able to provide that, but that we think that it's necessary. Is there any discussion or comment on that as a first recommendation?
The only thing that I would think on that first one is I would suggest that we include that central repository. You know, we're talking about Minnesota's. One of the big things about Minnesota's is they have people behind it. So
okay.
They have people behind it, they keep it up, they have people behind it that answer text, chat, calls when the families interact with that site, and then need help navigating that site, or so, okay, I get it, I understand, I see this is here, but I don't know where to go, how to do this point.
So it would be another bullet point under that, not only the repository itself and the work that that requires, but a staff that can provide ongoing information and answer questions, etc.
Maintain it, yeah, support the families
Yeah, good point.
as they interact and try to utilize that and get connected to everything that site's showing them.
Yeah, that makes very good sense. Any other comments on that? The second general recommendation, and it came through in multiple domains, was a multi-departmental effort to deal with the issue of public awareness. I mean, the things that everybody sees is that there is available information, there are resources that are in multiple places, but that one of the core issues is that people don't know. People don't know that transition is looming. They're not thinking about it. They're thinking about operating in their space with the situation and their family at the time. Certainly everybody owns a piece of this. And so this is a very general recommendation. The recommendation is that efforts should begin in the middle school years. As you know, IDEA mandates transition to begin in schools, and DESE has so authorized by the age of 16. The general consensus on review of the literature and ongoing discussion is that that's probably late in the process, and that earlier efforts would be worth considering. So Commission is recommending a multi-departmental consortium group discussion around who owns which part of this and how we can each partner, and healthcare owns a part of it as well for sure, how we can partner around increasing the general awareness, whether this is public service broadcast, whether this is disseminated across the state in other ways. So again, very general recommendation focused on the fact that we think people don't know it's coming and that we're probably getting started late. Any thoughts or comments on that one?
John?
Yes, Lindsay.
I really, really like stating the age of 12 years, because if Missouri can get their act together and do this, that would be like a leading state nation. because everybody is late with this. So I really appreciate that and like that.
So you're okay with it saying begin in the middle school years?
Absolutely.
Okay.
I would say they were early childhood, but that's fine. That's fine. But I'll take middle school.
Transition. Right.
Yeah.
It is interesting as I educated myself going through the literature and the other work that was done by folks in this group. There are different dates and different recommended ages from different groups, right? So IDEA says 16, American Academy of Pediatrics says 12, the Department of Health and Human Services has said maybe 14. So you kind of get these different perspectives, which I think reflects ongoing thought about it.
Just real quickly, and this is semantics, but I think we need to, on that one in particular, we need to make sure we say transition to adulthood, because when we start talking about middle school, they're all about transition, but it's transition to high school.
That's a great point.
And so I think we have to be very specific on that those discussions need to be not just transition to high school, but that plan is, and what is the plan for after high school, so that we can start talking about those steps that they need to do while in high school in order to have that transition.
Right. Yeah, good suggestion. Thanks.
I would agree. And I think that specificity is really helpful. And hopefully by us thinking ahead about that, that will head off. Well, it'll do hopefully two things, that it's not just because it could be, frankly, the way it's worded, I didn't think of it till you just said this, but it could be anything, right? Transition of what? There's a lot of transitions at the moment happening in our spaces. So I definitely like that transition to adulthood. Or one way I often say it is transition to post-secondary educational, there's other different ways to kind of describe it if we felt like adulthood might get pushback from different types of stakeholders. Because I know I can picture a middle school teacher or a middle school IEP team thinking, what? They're 12. And yet there's so many steps in that process. So I don't know. I think definitely adding a little bit of a clarification about transition to what is smart there.
Great, thank you. Those of you who know more than I do certainly about interdepartmental communication relationships and things is, we put a generic term there, other stakeholders. We're not limiting necessarily to DESI, DMH, VR, et cetera. Are there other groups that should be specifically called out? Should Health and Human Services be specifically listed there? What are your thoughts about that? Or is that generic enough that it makes the point for what we're interested in? What do you think?
I was gonna ask about that. Is there like because you said the APA, so the
American Academy of Pediatrics.
Or the APA. Do you have like a Missouri chapter of that? Or,
Yeah, we do.
You might want to specifically call that out just because it's such an important topic that we bring up.
Okay.
With healthcare.
Hold on, sorry. So I'm the immediate past president of the Missouri AAP, and I just want to clarify or better understand that. So the AAP national organization who puts out those kinds of recommendations, and the chapters are affiliates of that national organization. I think it would be fine to say something about the American Academy of Pediatrics recommends the following. And as such, the Missouri chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics is in full support or something like that.
Kristen, do you think if a group like this gets pulled together with these representatives of these respective groups, constituencies, would a representative from MOAAP be reasonable to include in that? From your point of view? Yeah, okay. That was my thought as well. Okay.
Yeah.
I think that's really important because I see the state agencies here, and I can tell you just from our experience in dealing and trying to provide outreach and education to either providers or consumers that no one is going to a state agency website looking for anything. And people learn things like this through their community, through their, their physicians, the people they deal with on the daily, their schools. And so, and sometimes there's even a little bit of distrust with state government. And so I think it is important to add in, and maybe identify some of those other stakeholders that, that really have more impact in the community.
Thank you for that.
Dr. Malamani?
Yes.
Yes, this is Paula Dar, and I know that we're not at the forefront, Department of Health and Senior Services, but especially through the Bureau of Special Healthcare Needs, we do serve individuals that do have autism. Autism in and of itself does not qualify for our programs. However, we do have participants that do have autism. So we would love to partner with you in providing education and getting awareness out there.
So is that specifically the Bureau for Special Healthcare Needs, or is it broader than that?
I would actually put it as DHS, Department of Health and Senior Services as a whole, because I'm sure there's other programs as well.
Okay, thanks. All right. Thank you.
And we may want to include social services as well.
Yeah, I'm not trying to leave anybody out. I mean,
Right.
whoever thinks.
They will have somewhat of ability. It's always questionable of how much participants read it and take the information that they put out. But with them having the Medicaid population, they will have kids who don't fall into DMH services with autism because they don't have that level of need necessary for our services, but they still have the ability to push out messaging. That transition at age 12 is really important.
So this line item, as I read it, is really about a public information effort. It's not aimed so much at adapting what is going on within the individual groups. I mean, absolutely, that's part of it, but this is collectively coming together and shouting out to the people of Missouri. This is a really important thing.
And to that point, as I read it, a lot of I don't have all the answers here. I guess I'm just gonna pose a brief question for consideration. A lot of the discussion we've had is we really wish that, to your point, the community providers that the families are actually receiving services from had a little bit more collaboration, cooperation, however you want to phrase it, with DESE and the school systems. I'm wondering if we can leverage this as part of that public information campaign, to where we recognize the importance of educating the actual providers who work with autism that this is best practice recommendations. It's important to not exist in a vacuum and collaborate with the school systems in the whole transition planning process.
Okay, great. Thanks, Seth. All right, number 3 was state grant support to fund family navigation personnel and systems. Another big item. It's also referenced in some of the specific domain areas. And there was comment, I don't remember which group advanced this, but there was comment that this needs to be somehow different from case manager, healthcare coordinators, others. This needs to be primarily a navigator, an advisor, an ombudsman who's aware of the range of things that folks need to experience. So that's the way I interpreted this specific item. Their comments are thoughts about that.
I guess the only thought or comment I have on it, I know it says state grant support, but I think ultimately, shouldn't we be working, if this doesn't already have a billing code, that this is a billing code? Under Medicaid, under eventually insurance.
Yeah, we actually have that under the healthcare area specifically. So, I felt, I sort of did this organization, but I felt like that was very specific to the health services area. And it involves Department of Insurance, it involves human health services, et cetera, through Medicare, through Medicaid, more than Medicare, actually. So I think we dealt with that at a later time, but which hopefully we'll see in a few minutes. Other thoughts before I jump? Okay. The last one in the general recommendations, and this could have gone under healthcare, but I don't think it's limited to healthcare. which is expansion of diagnostic services for older adolescents and adults. We know that there's inadequate services. We know that there's challenge services for all ages. But that really seems to be the point that needs to be called out in a general way. And the point was made by one of the work groups that there has been funding and support for diagnostic programs for younger individuals, particularly the preschool group, and we're going to hear some more about that this morning whenever Pam Thomas visits and shares what's going on. But I think we all agreed this was something that was necessary, and we call out that this is going to require some effort. This is going to require some thought and some planning. So we specifically called out the Echo Autism model, but didn't limit it to that. But that's a way to expand diagnostic capabilities through providers. But this idea is going to have to go broader than the half a dozen or however many ultimately Missouri Autism Centers there are. This is going to have to go out more broadly and involve programs within DMH, perhaps other programs as well. Comments or corrections for that one?
I'm curious if we could put something in about increasing the level that state can pay for evaluations. Currently, VR can pay for evaluations, but we pay at such a low level that we can't get anybody to do those diagnoses for us. And that's set at like the Medicaid rate, but it's really difficult for us to find anybody. And then the people that do have typically like, just told somebody, well, I guess you'll wait a year. Like I can get you in and get you moving with other things, but that diagnosis can take at least a year to get in with the people that we can pay. So I don't know if that's probably a lofty piece, but we've got to be able to pay people.
Oh, I don't think that's unreasonable, Luke, at all. I mean, so the reason that the state, an important reason, as I interpret it, why the state supports the existing autism centers and provides grant funding is that we lose. So if 100% of the cost for an autism center, I can speak for ours in St. Louis, we recover 25% of the cost, of our cost. So I'm sure it's the same for the older population as well. And I'm sure that that's an issue around the state in terms of treatment services, support services, you name it. And you know, maybe that should in fact be a number 5 big picture item, which is if you want to provide services for people, you're going to have to look at reimbursement rates. That's called out specifically, I think, in terms of the housing issue, but I think we could, what do you guys think about that? I mean, it's a general issue.
And there's just so many resources that are limited to having that diagnosis. So we can do quite a bit to work around it, but they're not going to be able to access the same level of supports. I mean, and that's going to go across the board for all of our areas that we're focusing on. So yes, I would agree.
Other people's thoughts on that?
Kristen's all higher.
Kristen, you had a thought?
Yeah, I have 2 thoughts. So I'll answer my first thought I'll hold on to. My second thought is related to the reimbursement rates. I do think that's appropriate. And I agree that having a Medicaid reimbursement rate that's more commiserate with what the time that it takes to do, especially more complex diagnostic evaluations for older adolescents is going to be really important. So I do think that should be a number 5 recommendation. Now, my first thought was actually related to the statement itself as far as expansion of diagnostic services. I would really encourage us not to just limit it to diagnostic services, but also to, so for example, especially for the transition aged kids, I'm as a clinician who serves them, I'm usually needing updated testing to be able to form an appropriate supports and services plan for that transition age. And the access to that is also very, very small. I think that there are lots of ways that we could increase the capacity of our community psychologists and others to serve in that capacity for not just diagnostic services, but also that essentially that longitudinal paradigm of, all right, about every 3 to 5 years, getting updated testing is actually really important. And it would save the state. Okay, well, I don't know about save the state, but it would allow us to make better informed supports and services plans rather than just operating off of a diagnostic report that may be a decade old. So I think that's another piece. My recommendation would be to say expansion of assessment services for older adolescents and young adults. So that way it encompasses not just the initial diagnostic assessment, but also, again, updated assessments so that we can formulate those plans.
Okay, noted, thanks.
I wanted to say, the increased reimbursement really fits into the whole thing of how we're supporting families. You know, because when you're, like you said, when you get it, you go, oh, good, we're gonna have a test. Come back in 13 months. That's not supporting families whose concerns are today or
Sure.
tomorrow. So I think it really fits into that broad spectrum across the whole thing. Working with families, which is the person and families are be the highest priority.
And I think I actually pulled this one out of the family support work group. It had been listed in their report, but I felt it was a bigger one and I wanted to put it in the general category. So I agree with you. It clearly is related to individual and family support.
Can I add one other consideration? You know, this, when Kristen said, you know, add additional to diagnostic services, I also think to the work that's being done elsewhere in the state, DMH, the Department of Developmental Disabilities, you know, my work that I get to participate in the MOAD Advisory Council. There's a big push in recognizing that there's an underserved mental health need with this population, and if we're putting in a specific recommendation for expanding diagnostic services and even assessment services for adolescents and adults, what we're going to see is identification of a lot more people who need mental health counseling, mental health care, and I think we would want to be consistent with the push that's being done in DMH and the Department of Developmental Disabilities and add a recommendation to also expand the state's capacity to serve the mental health needs of this transition age population.
Sure, yeah, good idea, thanks. Okay. We're gonna now jump into the specific domains, and so I'm going to be looking to the people that worked in those groups to be sure that their recommendations are adequately reflected here. The first one was modified targeted case management services, particularly for children and individuals not eligible for Medicaid waiver programs. That was a clear recommendation from one of the work groups. All right, we good with that? Contractual requirements for targeted case management entities to require service coordinators for DMH and children's division contracts to receive additional training. This comes through repeatedly in our recommendations. There's always support, education and training for staff specifically on any of these recommendations. So this came directly from one of the groups as well.
When I looked at, would there be any benefit is how often or, because when you say provide trainings for the coordinators, you know, things change after every legislative session. How often would that be that they need to be updated?
Yeah, you're right.
This might be somewhere else in here, but I find a lot of families, it's retention of caseworkers that's hard, you know, because it's hard for families to get to know a caseworker and start working and then have someone random call them a month later and they don't call them back because they don't know who they are and then they're dropped. That's very common.
Yeah, that's a broader issue, I think, reflected across all of these areas, which is recruitment and retention of high quality staff is a challenge in every area. And we sometimes deal with that indirectly by talking about staff orientation and training, but retention is another very big issue. And I certainly support that. Family support number 3, educational and technical assistance to enable and support. Again, professional competencies related to transition planning, including facilitation of person-centered plans within all relevant state departments. That's a general recommendation, again, that came from the family support subgroup. Refinements or recommendations on that one? You know, the tension that I see here is one, in some cases, we're pretty directive and explicit about what we recommend and how we recommend something. In other cases, we're pretty general about it. So, you know, when we say provide educational technical assistance to support professional competencies, that's a pretty general concept. Unless you're in the operational machinery, though, of those groups, I think it becomes difficult to say that means this many hours or this many things. So I think we all recognize that these recommendations in some cases are pretty general, and they're really designed to shine a light on a concern. Some cases we've offered specific recommendations for improvements, and in other cases we've sort of laid out the issue. So that is within the document, and you'll see it as we go on. I don't know how to refine that better unless there are people that know the details well enough. I also think that when you think of who we're writing this document for, we're not really writing it for individual agencies. We're not really writing it for individual divisions or departments as much as we're trying to call attention and support the, I'm sure, already awareness within these groups of where our commission sees the important challenges. Number 4 here.
Jen,
Yeah.
I just wanted to say something about that. As a previous provider, I actually prefer it to be more vague than coming up with some arbitrary number that somebody in the higher ups came up with, because I know that I've had experiences where somebody comes up with a number, you need to have X number of hours and such, and you want to know why, and nobody can tell you why. Where I think, at least when it's more vague, then areas can figure it out and discuss it together.
And we hope that folks will, the people that really have the knowledge and then have the authority in these areas can look at this and say that this is how we would interpret it. So thanks for that. The 4th one is increasing the Missouri Autism Project funding for programs to support transition planning, support the needs for the growing number. So again, this is a capacity where there's just more financial support needed because there's more work online and coming down the road here very quickly. This one came from the group, which is a transition essentials checklist. So this one's pretty explicit, to be completed at every IEP meeting after a student reaches 12 years of age. And that is a required step in the process. I don't know, and I would be unlikely to know, what the current process is in terms of the DESE regulations with regard to conforming to IDEA requirements. But I do know that there is a requirement, and I see them in the IEPs that I read. There is a page about transition, for sure. You know, so we're recommending here a transition essentials checklist. We don't say what transition essentials are. We simply say we think you need to have a checklist about them that reflect the intent of the group that put that together.
Yes, it was sort of just something that could be a trigger that every family, you know, that would almost mandate, if you will, that these questions had to be asked. So there would also be a routine way of educating the family about questions they should be asking at every year.
The other thing it does do is it moves the age down to 12, again, to the points that have been made earlier. So if they're operating under IDEA regs right now, this challenges them to think about doing it earlier.
Same comment about the language on there, just transition essentials, I think we have to be more specific, especially at age 12, because they'll see it as transition to high school.
Do you think if we put a comment in the beginning, like, you know how they do it, like when transition from this here on out, when you see this word, it means transition to adulthood? Could you do that? Or we, like, this could be specific because it's in quotes.
Yeah.
But
I think you could put it in this report, but when we're given those types of recommendations and then she places where I put it, I think it's very important that we make it very clear. Because this whole report is transition to adulthood, that's what it's labeled, but not to lose that title when we start applying it in the real world, because there are so many transitions, especially at age 12 and middle school, that I think we just have to be specific.
So is it a good idea or a bad idea to try to deal with that generically by saying the importance of transition to adolescence and adulthood? Because really, we are talking about transition to and during adolescence.
Yeah.
Is it to or is it during? But in any case, whichever the preposition choice is, to bring that in to particularly reflect the recommendations relevant to schools. Does that deal with some of those concerns?
I think that would be helpful, because when you're at middle school, it's always open to interpretation, right? So even when we say transition to adulthood, that people could take that as well. The next step's high school, so here we've done it. I think we just have to be clear that we want people to take a better look, a bigger lens when they're looking at that transition in middle school. It means it's not just to the next step, but you've got to start having those conversations about, and what is the step after that? Because to the point we're all trying to make, doing it at 16 when they're already in high school is too late for a lot of people. They needed to start this process earlier.
Right. Yeah, important points, thanks. Going to community and independent living, 3 recommendations. Stabilize community living services by fully funding. We're back to financial support again. And this is specific. According to the Mercer audited rate, ensure cost of living adjustments are automatic, require budgetary adjustments to provide the resources, et cetera. So this is provide now and create a process whereby these cost of living adjustments are incorporated. That I suspect that requires actions of the legislature and budgetary decisions, but I think it's a good recommendation. And it has a benchmark, which I think is useful. So what do you mean increase funding? Well, the Mercer audited rate is something that has been operationalized over time, so that's useful. Comments about that one? Number 2 is develop and support a program within DESE to encourage and provide grant funding to local school districts to support programs which implement self-determination, advocacy, curricula such as life course, etc. are embedded within school curriculum. Such tools can integrate students into their own IEP transition planning process. Comments about that? I like the fact that it offers some recommended sources, if you will, for that activity. Number 3, multimedia parent education materials regarding the variety of community living opportunities. And this is referenced as well when we get to this actually came from the independent living group, where it said parents simply don't know what's out there, what the options are, nor, according to the work group, do many parents even know what the positive spin on all that is. There's sort of this negative spin about, you got to think about your child, your young adult, moving away from you, living away from you, which is a daunting challenge for many families and parents. But there's not that other side of the coin, which is actually this can be a really good thing. And here's the evidence that says it's a good thing when it's appropriate. So I thought that was a very helpful suggestion. And also reference to the idea that this information should be included in that general informational repository. All right. Jumping to healthcare, I'm going to gloss over this one really quickly unless people want to specifically raise issues about it. Kristen Soul, I know you read it, and you co-authored it. So did you have thoughts? Do you think that represented the recommendations that we put together?
I did. Yeah, I thought it looked great.
Okay. So this is the one where we get into things like, look at number 4, the point that was raised earlier. Ensure that Missouri Medicaid compensates clinicians for an existing ICD-10 code, which I understood in a communication from Carrie, and correct me if I'm wrong, Carrie, I understood that that is not presently within the Medicaid regs. Am I correct?
Right, that transition language, yeah, that's not currently in the statute.
Okay, so we're
Or payment for services or benefits for services for transition.
asking that that be done in this item. And where would that come from? Would that come from the Department of Commerce and Insurance, or?
So we don't typically put legislation forward. Usually the legislation that is in our chapter, specifically chapter 376, where all of the healthcare stuff is usually organizations, either provider organizations or other types of groups who find lobbyists to develop the changes that they want to make. They, they track down sponsors. They do that type of work behind the scenes, and then maybe they'll approach us to discuss with us, whether or not what they want to do is actually going to work, and something that would be that would work with the way. We all know that sometimes things are in a statute, and that we all know that's not the way they work. And so it is important for groups to bring that to us so we can look at it and so we can have a discussion about it. And of course that happens during the legislative process too, when the sponsor files the bills.
So what I'm hearing, and I didn't know factually, this would not be considered within the range of the department in terms of a regulation. This really needs to come down as a statute.
It's possible that, and I haven't looked at the regulations that were promulgated to interpret this particular statute recently, but it's possible that there could be some type of regulatory change, a rule change that could, it's just that anything that goes beyond what's in the statute would probably be rejected, honestly, if we tried to do it by regulation, because we wouldn't have the statutory authority. Okay. So it may require a statutory change. I don't know that it could be done through regulation.
Okay. So operationally, maybe this is something we'll talk about later. What would be the best process to work through? Because this is a key feature of anything that's going to change within healthcare and provision of transition services is going to relate to reimbursement for a transition code. I think if we go to people and ask them to provide an unsupported service, certainly some will, but it's much harder to gain a consensus to that. Okay, so I wanted to get into some of the other areas before our time is getting short. Let's go to post-secondary education. And it again talks about continuing ed related to transition education. And I'll make a general note that we'll amend every time we use that word in terms of a recommendation. We will specify what we actually mean by that to deal with that issue. For special and general educators, counselors working with students aged 12 to 18 with IEPs. So this came from the post-secondary ed group. Any comments, corrections on that? Number 2 is, again, an encourage and support DESI one. Increase inclusion of students with ASD in general ed classrooms and classes and implementation of universal design for learning framework. Comments on that? The great thing about these recommendations, it is hard to say that any of them are not great. They would all do good things, right? So we can talk about the details, and we can talk about implementation, we can talk about obstruction or obstacles, but they're all great ideas. Incentivize Missouri institutions of higher ed to provide virtual ed opportunities on transition and professional development opportunities for post-secondary education faculty and staff. So this is, we're asking again for education of the people that are in positions to help. Encourage and provide grant funding to local school districts, pilot programs for self-determination advocacy curricula, and there's some specific projects recommended there, into high school classes to increase students' awareness. So this is reaching to the level now of the students to increase their awareness and perhaps to encourage advocacy for their own educational needs and supports, which obviously we all think is great.
John, the only thing I would add is, since we're going down to 12, I'd say into middle and high school classes.
Sure. Okay. Number 5, identify and share information about opportunities for this whole range of post-secondary educational opportunities, certificates, degrees, development programs, etc., to encourage post-secondary ed for individuals with ASD, encourage higher ed disability offices to connect with high school transition and vocational coordinators for information about transition. So we would hope that that would be going on, but calling that out as a specific recommendation makes sense. Comments on that? Number 6 is a state-funded transportation service for individuals with ASD to access post-secondary ed programming. Yeah, everybody good with that?
So one thing that may be missing on here, I know apprenticeships and other types of certifications and training programs are a big push of the governor for sure right now, and we're putting lots of different things in place across the state, and I think we'd be remiss to not include that in here as post-secondary options for individuals.
So just the word apprenticeships?
I think we definitely need to put that in here somewhere, or certification programs. That I know it's not your higher education, and maybe even emphasizing community colleges, they have some different programs, degree programs, or apprenticeships and certification programs that can that are great for everybody, but definitely including individuals with autism.
So broaden it, is what
Yeah.
you're saying.
Yeah.
Would that fall under, if you use the term career and technical education?
I think so.
Okay. Yeah, that's stuff, post-secondary, it is not just
Okay.
college. It is
Yeah.
definitely vocational training programs, all of that stuff, whatever is needed for that student.
I know VR also does a focus on on-the-job training. Right now, we're having good success with that, getting people employed, but then their employers are paying for certification. You might provide tools or something along those lines. So I think that's a good one. We see a lot of success with our autistic individuals utilizing that because they're able to go to work. It's much more realistic to what they're seeing on the job. So it's all hands-on and you get a paycheck. So
that's great.
That's nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, the post-secondary ed and the employment certainly have a lot of overlap, very clearly. There are individual areas that they are more specific for, but there's plenty of overlap to be sure. Anything else in that post-secondary ed grouping? I'll move to employment. We're encouraging and supporting DESI again. for educational efforts to require transition education for educators, working with this age population, including continuing ed and license maintenance requirements. Again, a fairly general recommendation that is designed to provide emphasis in terms of that educational ongoing process. Comments on that? The next one is pre-employment transition services, and this is relevant to what we've just been discussing. And I just took the words that came from the group. So if there's things that should be added to that, job exploration, work-based learning experiences, workplace readiness training, community agencies, to develop employment goals for students, individual transition plans. Is that broad enough, or do we need some more offerings there within the parentheses? Everybody okay with that? Broad enough? Assist TMH, DESE, and Missouri Association of People Supporting Employment First in passing employment first mandates and focusing on fully leveraging VR opportunities for those with ASD by maximizing the funding for VR programs. So let me ask a question. Is MOAPSI an advocacy organization? I don't know what this organization is.
Yes, it is.
So they would be the ones, the point that Carrie was making earlier, they're the type of group that goes in front of the legislature and advocates for their constituents.
Absolutely.
Because, and I've had this discussion before, so those of you that know, please help with this. So DMH, DESE, Department of Commerce and Insurance, Department of Health and Senior Services, how much advocacy involves the legislature? How is it a part of their charge to make suggestions to the legislature about funding, changes in direction, or things of that type, or not?
As a state agency?
Yeah.
No.
That's what I thought.
So yeah, I mean, we are not allowed to advocate. We can provide information, we can answer questions, we can talk about what's working and what's not working. We can make requests for funding through our department request to the governor. But then once the governor's budget comes out, that is what we support.
Yeah, no, and so I've gotten that sense because before I was sitting with people who know, I assumed that that could be a two-way street. But what I'm hearing more and more and more is it's really not a two-way street. Right? It's that the constituents go to their elected representatives and say, this is something that we need. The representatives go through their process and then implement that in discussion with state agencies. Is that fair?
Sometimes.
Okay.
So sometimes that discussion happens, and sometimes we see a bill on December 1st that's been pre-filed that we were not aware of, and sometimes they get it right, and sometimes it's not so right.
Yeah. Well, but I think it's relevant for us as a commission to be aware of this is in no way a judgment conversation. It's relevant to know if we're advocating for changes in policy, for changes in funding, for changes in direction, then it's probably not appropriate for us to be relying on the state departments to initiate those conversations.
Yeah, it's a very fine line that we have to walk because we need to be responsive to both those that we're supporting and to the legislature when they ask and inquire and want to understand. But it's very specific. We do not advocate. We can be in support of legislation as part of the governor's package of legislative priorities, but that's really about as far as it goes.
Okay, thank you.
So how would you clarify then DMH has been very supportive of employment first and came out before the legislation came out with it. So, I mean, this actually did get passed like 2 days ago out of committee. So I don't know if it's that we're at this point supporting the passing of it, because by the time this report's published, it might be passed already. But I think the other parts of it, fully leveraging the opportunities within it, are spot on. I guess it's sort of a question mark timing wise of when this goes to press. Because
Well,
Representative Stinnett
It's
just.
okay, we can check this one off as done.
We did good, guys.
That's a good one. Encourage and provide grant funding to local school districts to create comprehensive transition programs that include work-study opportunities, career technical education, voc training, paid work experiences, etc. So this again is simply advocating for increased support of the school districts to support their students in moving into a pre-employment pathway. Right? Sounds consistent with what we've been saying. But, no. Last one, encourage and provide grant funding for pilot programs, Project Search, VR summer work programs across the state to determine the effectiveness of programs for students with ASD and employment post-school outcomes. So this would be a situation in which who would invite these grants as you guys think about this? You have to put out a request for grants to the schools. So DESE, I guess?
Jesse, or what about the SB 40 boards? Would they offer grants through that? No.
You don't just they generally don't just wholeheartedly offer out. I mean, you have to go to them with a concept generally and say, would you fund X? So it would be sort of going to all 66 of those and asking them.
So then the question, Jeannie, is so who's going to start the process to try to achieve this goal, which is to get more grant funding for pilot programs? Who initiates that process and who do they talk to?
Well, VR, I mean, funds the transition piece within DESE or from DESE. So is there an avenue within VR to look at? I know you don't get to say this is where the funding should go, but is there is there an advocacy route within VR?
Luke's ready to open
funds as they.
Yeah.
Give them all.
You're at a check. No. So there's kind of two parts to it, because summer work is funded through VR completely. So that's not as much a grant as much as please pull down the full national amount so we can match it and be able to fund it. So I think that goes more to the fully leveraging the VR funds. We do not have we are also in the same boat of not really being able to advocate in the same ways, although we do work with, there's the Missouri Rehab Associations, which is a group of providers and VR folks that can do some legislative work. There's a couple others, but it's all how we allocate those funds. The problem is that we just need to make sure that we have enough.
Right. It's the best market in the world, and people just don't realize it's a 90-10 match. So for every dollar the state puts in, the feds put in 90. You know what I meant.
Every 10,
Thank
put
you.
in 90.
Come on, I'm not a math whiz. So I think that's what always stymies providers is that, we could raise that threshold of the VR budget, but VR is not allowed to just do that. So
Right.
some emphasis has happened to get the ball rolling on it. And I don't know who nudges VR to say, change your budget. So I don't know where the director
VR wants to do it. I mean, let's
Yes.
assume that VR would be happy to accept more support.
For sure.
We are heavily legislated, even like we can't get a new full-time employee. Like we have a set amount and you have to reorganize them. So our funding is very legislated at a state level, which is frustrating. We actually have a quality VR program because the state does do matching. So we're rare in that. Most states don't actually access that. But what happens when we're fully funded is we can actually pull down what other states aren't using as well. So if we're continuing to fund at the state level, VR, we continue to have more money, but it's all from the legislative and what they approve. We can make a recommendation on here's what we think the budget should be and how we think it's gonna help. But we can't necessarily like go advocate, if that makes
Yeah, so,
sense.
I mean, it's clear to me that at these departmental levels, to move the agenda, there's gonna have to be an expansion of partnerships around organizations who are in the advocacy business. Because they're the ones who are gonna get to the legislature. Now, they may benefit from your information or from what the opportunities are, or but what individuals might know about matching funds, governmental or otherwise. So I think that that's something that we just have to continue to remind each other that when we say to Desi, why don't you get some more money to do this? That's not what they do, essentially. Pam Thomas is sitting there, she knows way more about this than I do, but what I've been hearing all morning is essentially that the issues with regard to intra-departmental influence regarding programmatic change and funding and those types of things is very closely tied to the legislative will to make those changes because they control the support. All right, I'm going to move on quickly in that because we do want to give Pam time to move us to the next topic. So number 6 is a guide to assist large employment organizations in determining how to develop an inclusive culture. Yeah. Number 7 is, again, a state transportation system, this time for individuals to access job opportunities. So I think we're looking for state-funded transportation for both job training and for job opportunities. The last one, in terms of recommendations, legal status guardianship, is review and enforce the policies on the criteria for granting guardianship and work within the court system to ensure broad understanding of the options available. What I took away from the report from the work group was that there probably is adequate legislative support for this concept within Missouri, but the application of these processes within Missouri has perhaps not kept pace with some other states. Is that true?
Probably, and I'm also, there's flexibility across counties, so, there's different ways that it's implemented. And I think one thing we could put on there is, and we kind of touched on it a little bit on this, when it talks about the range of options, but there's a lot of opportunity between full guardianship and not having any, control's not the right word, but any ability to support your family member in decision making. And there's a wide range there, and some places maybe don't see that range. It's like the option is no full guardianship or no guardianship.
That's not consistent with the statute, as I understand it.
Correct. There's the ability. There's a difference between the ability to do stuff and what actually happens.
The requirement.
Yeah. And so as you go across with different counties, different judges, different beliefs, it can look very different. You can have some areas of the state that are very much operating in that range of let's look at this individual and see that they perhaps need help here, but they're perfectly fine to make decisions on the rest of it. And then there are other areas of the state where it's like, oh, you're having problems? Guardianship.
Well, that, I think point 2 tried to deal with that, which is to training for guardians ad litem, attorneys, judges on the range of options for effective guardianship. We had a presentation about it, and I certainly didn't know what the entire range was. And since I don't make the decisions, it may be less critical for me to know, but I can at least inform my families that, hey, it's not all or none.
Right.
So I think getting the the folks that are in the decision-making roles to understand and perhaps empathize more broadly with that. And so you'll see I think it's the only place where we said in any part of this document, ensure that current Missouri law is followed appropriately. So that's a pretty strong recommendation from a group of commissioners, which is like, follow the law, guys. I mean, you're lawyers and judges, but follow the law. Right?
Well, follow the law that's appropriate for that person. They are following the law because the law allows full guardianship.
Sure,
And
yeah.
so
I
they're
take
just
your point.
imposing their perception or interpretation of what needs to occur for that individual.
And the last one on that list was to, again, to encourage and support DESE and school districts to provide students and family with information. So I would not know to what extent guardianship is discussed within school IEP transition plans or approaches. So I would only be guessing, but I would not guess that it's a robust discussion.
Hopping back quickly to number 2, is there a role that public administrators play in the guardianship process that they should also be included? I just don't know exactly what that
They should
role
be
is.
included.
So public administrators? Okay.
Because that is the same, you see that same variation in your public administrators who've been assigned to administer the guardianship for these individuals.
Okay.
Some very much operate within the range of what is needed and necessary for that individual, and others very much operate in the what is allowed, and so they go to one end or the other.
Yeah, that's an easy add, thanks. We'll do that. All right, sorry to rush you all through this. I do want to open the possibility for people who either hadn't had the opportunity to look carefully at the document, given the narrow time window that was provided, or that want to think more about something. But I'm going to create a drop dead date of next Friday. If I don't hear from you by next Friday, I'm assuming that you're okay. And then we're gonna move it along and file the report as appropriate. So not trying to be difficult about this, but we do have to say there has to be a time whenever we're done. And hopefully within a week, you can just send a specific email or comment to Kristen Morgan and I. And the intent here, as you heard, I think, in the discussion, is to take the comments, the recommendations that are made, and to add them and to amend as they're recommended. So if you think something needs to be said differently, or if you think something needs to be emphasized differently, just tell us what it is. We're not going to argue with you about it. The purpose of this is to represent the best judgment of the commissioners. Fair enough? Great. Thank you all very much. So I do think it might be sensible to take a 5-minute break for those that would like to have one. And then, because I do want to give Pam plenty of time, but we've got her time for presentation, discussion, and we've got lunch. So we're really good till about 12:30 here in terms of this next phase. And we all need to we all need to, for a moment, exhale transition and intake early intervention. So let's take that moment to do this.
I'm not too much. I'll be back.
Okay.
Yeah. Good to see you in person, Casey.
Return a bit.
Good to see you in person, Krista.
How are you?
It's been a little bit.
Yeah.
Okay.
Good, we've been really busy lately, time of year, but
I'm sure.
yeah.
But everybody's doing well here.
Yeah. Julie couldn't be here today, she's out of town today and tomorrow.
Okay.
I'm sure she says hi.
Oh, of course, yes, for sure.
Yeah.
Do you guys have any water bottles? I didn't.
Water bottles, that's a little cups.
Okay.
Yeah.
Or anything like to access all of this.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. If you could get like, that could.
Oh,
If you could
Okay.
Add it to it,
Okay.
just do it.
Okay, I just didn't know, like,
Yo.
looking out if there's, like, I don't wanna miss the point, does that make sense?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
So I think the most is available.
And then I just, for the microphone, push, it'll go green.
It goes
Yeah.
red.
It'll go
Just
red.
kind of frustrating.
Okay.
Or.
Yeah, just think, yeah.
This is great
Oh,
because in
okay.
our student education meeting room, once they put the mics on, you're live the
Yeah,
whole time. So they're hot, what we call it.
Yeah.
So we're always like, wait until you get the signal that we're not live streaming. And then they put them all on or they put them all off, so they're all
Because
wired.
it.
So yeah, I'm real careful not to say anything.
Yeah.
Just in case, but so that's nice.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. It works out pretty well
We
in here.
do
We got
go
the new
pre-cap
camera system, so it kind of like follows you around the room.
Oh,
Use that versus talking.
nice.
So pretty fancy.
Pretty cool.
Yeah.
We're supposed to get our boardroom updated. I think it's not this fall, maybe next summer. And they're wanting to do something. I mean, it's nice, but we just have it upgraded. However, they don't know how long. So right now we just
That whole building.
the whole building is, but we have like what we call
Are we
a
getting it
PowerPoint
there?
box, and it's just a
But we can't
screen in the
find
middle of. So
fair
we don't
power.
look up there. It's all in the middle of the desk
I think
setup,
that
which is
maybe
kind of
there-
nice.
Yeah.
Because everybody is looking in one direction.
Yeah.
But we can't always see who's on the Zoom. You know, what I
Right.
mean?
So
So
degrees, but it's
yeah,
not available.
it's pretty nice.
I don't know where the clicker is, so I just have to sit up here and I'll just.
Just nod, yeah, just nod. Yeah, that's fine.
Non. Certificate CP programs such as fair power. Because I think they're quality, and they should be funded. But we. And then I would probably take out this second sentence. Yeah, thank you.
Go back on the record here. So I want to welcome Pam Thomas, who's here this morning at our invitation to speak to us about Office of Childhood and all of the relevant issues as we are kicking off the next phase of our commission project with regard to early childhood. And I believe Dr. Scheinkopf is on the call. He's out of the country, but is joining by video. He has been very instrumental in leading what we're calling Phase 2A, which was really a focus on surveillance, screening, and diagnostic testing in young children. Our focus for this next year will be on the 0 to 5 population. And so, as we've done in the past, we wanted to have a true expert come in and educate us from their perspective around the topic. And Pam also will share with us information I know about the Office of Childhood and how what they're doing will be highly relevant to the sorts of assessment and recommendations that we will be making. She's also agreed to work with Steve on the second phase of this early childhood process, which is access to services, which is right where she lives. So we figured that was a great place for her to assist, and she's kindly agreed to work with us on that. So Pam, thank you for being here and for joining the group and helping us out.
Right, let me check the time. Is it good morning? It's still good morning. Thank you so much for the kind words. My name is Pam Thomas, and I've been with the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education for almost 16 years. 12 of those years, I was the Part C program coordinator. So many people who know me from that space. And then I had a year, I call my sabbatical, a year in HR and strategic planning during COVID, which was super exciting. And then the last going on 3 years, I've been in that larger space of early learning, early childhood, and helping to launch the Office of Childhood. So happy to be of assistance to the commission. Thank you for the invitation, and I look forward to that opportunity. So I do want to mention just quickly for those of you that may not know some of the information about this, the Office of Childhood launched in August of 2021. It is in the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, and we basically took early childhood and after-school programs that were occurring in 3 different state departments and consolidated those into one office. As you can see on the graphic here, we had overlap in many areas: home visiting, early child care, professional development, our advisory council and stakeholder outreach activities were really present across all 3 of the all 3 of the state departments moving into one office. Now, unique for this conversation, all of our Part B and Part C of IDEA activities, which is our Federal Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, I believe everyone here is familiar with that, they were already in the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. So for that part, there wasn't much transition. However, they were in different offices. So we kind of, even within the department, moved 3 different offices into one. So there was even some internal transitions there. I do want to make a quick note that the piece that we are now realizing, which I'll talk about just in a minute, is that we had programs in bubbles, and we knew the programs, but we didn't know how they were connecting into other programs, and that's really been the work for the first 2 years in the office. All right, so just want to break down, we get this question a lot even today, and that is what programs went into the office and what programs did not go into the office. So I just want to give you a little bit more of a floor level look at what programs that is. So we have 5 sections in our office that are really our direct services, direct programming pieces. The first being home visiting. So our parent education is the program that's known most, I think, across the state, and that's the Parents as Teachers school-based program through school districts. By statute, all are required to have a parent education program or contract for one. Also in home visiting, which is now all in one section, is our federally funded home visiting around promoting healthy outcomes. So if those of you that are familiar with MCV funded model programs or MCH or Title V funded programs, those are all now in that same section with parent education, and they're working to align their services. All of them do developmental screening, and all of them make appropriate referrals to other services like early childhood special education and first steps. Early intervention is the state's Part C program, most commonly known as First Steps. And our quality programs is where we have our public preschool programs. That's where early childhood special education lives, and how they serve that in how they serve children in multiple funded preschool programs. So Title I, as far as the practices, lives there. State funded preschool and school districts live there, and so they've been trying to take all of those different funded programs and make that a quality preschool programming. Our before and after school programs are also in quality programs, as well as much of our initiatives for professional development and training everyone across the sector of early childhood. Then we have 2 child care arms, and sometimes folks call our office the Office of Child Care, because sometimes that work is very big. But we have the Child Care Subsidy Program. As you know, that is providers enrolling and being paid for child care services if the families qualify for subsidy, which is at 150% poverty level or below. And also child care licensing, which is in the compliance world. So that's where our providers go to be licensed, and then we monitor the licensed facilities. And as you probably know, in the state of Missouri, if you are going to provide services to more than 6 children in a child care setting, you do have to be licensed. There are some exemptions to that, such as public school districts and other types of educational settings, but in general. Oh, before I move off of that, Kristen, I do want to mention some pieces that did not come to the office. So in the world of special education, early childhood special education practices, so some of those quality pieces around instructional practices and curriculum practices, when applicable, those came to the Office of Childhood, and the funding came to the Office of Childhood. Our state plan requirements, because as you know, early childhood special education is the Part B 619 section, or what we call Little B, is part of what we call Big B, which is K-12. They all run in one state plan. So the state plan or the state regulations for IDEA Part B still live in the Office of Special Education, which I think you guys have met with Mark Wheatley, and he's been here before. And so he is the Assistant Commissioner over the Office of Special Education. The other piece that did not move to the Office of Childhood is the data collection and federal reporting. Because that's all housed under IDEA Part B, that also is in the Office of Special Education, and so we work closely with them on that. So I want to step back for just a minute and really talk about the space of our office and looking at the landscape of Missouri. So we've been spending a lot of time talking about access and who should we be reaching and who should we be trying to help serve in our office. So keep in mind, all of our programs in the office, including early childhood special education and First Steps, in essence, are voluntary programs or require parent consent for us to do this. So this is not a situation of if you build it, they will come. This is a situation of we need to look to see what is the reasonable number of families and children that we should be serving, and how do we create space that families want to come to receive these programs and services. So that's really important for us in thinking about the landscape. So just at a quick glance here, and I love to say this, so I'm going to say it, our donut graphs, I love to say that, but they kind of just tell you what is the reasonable number of families in our population, children in our population that we should be serving. So I know that John and I had a quick email exchange on looking at the number of children that have a special health care need, in that what is the source in which we're using for that. So I did want to follow up to that email that we had. So the citation that's listed here is basically referencing the 2019-2020 data from the Center from Child and Adolescent Health. So that's the Children with Special Health Care Needs piece of that. So there could be other types of disabilities and other considerations that would make that a little larger. I do know just from the CDC data that about 13% of children across the nation are expected to have a mild to moderate developmental delay. So depending on where that falls within special health care needs or evaluation for IDEA, we know that number is probably small. If you really lay over disabilities and delays and other types of things that are happening, that number is probably a little bit closer to 20%. But just want to couch that percentage there. So I'm going to just kind of take it for the purpose of this commission. I guess I'll pause here for just a moment because shared a little bit of that high level information around our office. And if I could just pause if anyone has questions before we take a deeper dive into Part C and Part B, 619. Just wanted to stop for just a moment if you have any questions in general. Okay, hearing none, we'll go ahead and continue. So one of the things I think that's been, where I've spent most of my time in some of the working sessions with the commission is really explaining what that process looks like with program eligibility. So I'm going to start with first steps and early childhood special education. And so on the first step side of it, which is on the left side of your screen here, the criteria for children participating in the program are, of course, birth to age 3. And then there's 2 ways in general that you qualify. One is an automatic condition or an eligibility with a medical condition that's automatic criteria. Those are things like a diagnosis of autism and other types of medical conditions. Or you can enter into eligibility through a developmental delay. And the criteria for that is a half age. This is where we get a lot of questions around the confusion with when those families transition to early childhood special education. That is a different program in what's considered eligibility. So the child does have to be 3 or older in order to qualify. You can be age 5 and have that kindergarten year eligibility under a developmental delay, which is the young child with developmental delay in some situations. But that criteria is 2 standard deviations in one area and 1.5 standard deviations in 2 areas. And that doesn't always align really well with a half age delay in an early intervention world. So we can talk about that a little bit more if need be. The piece that really becomes confusing, I think, is there isn't an automatic qualifier for autism diagnosis in the early childhood special education realm. That's probably the biggest difference. And we do a lot of explanation with that in early intervention for families when children enter in with that diagnosis to help prepare for them. So what they have to do to qualify is they have to have an adverse impact on the student's performance or the student's educational needs. So that involves a lot of looking at what's happening in their behaviors, looking at their standardized scores, some informal assessments, and really getting a good look at what that student's performance is and the need for special education. So I think that's probably where we get most of our questions. And then I think the other side of that becomes, well, how do they get into the early child or the special education realm? Where are those referrals coming from? And right now I will say, where are the children? Because through the pandemic and post-pandemic, our numbers in early childhood special education dropped significantly. And I don't have those in front of me, but I can get those for you in our annual report. And then as they're returning, and we're slowly seeing those numbers come up, they're not returning to the post or to the pre-pandemic numbers. They're slowly coming back up. But we're also at the same time seeing the primary placement for children isn't in the regular classroom. It's in that separate space, in that separate classroom. And that means that children's behaviors are more challenging than they were pre-pandemic. And I'm not saying anything that's a surprise to anyone at the table here. But I think that also we recognize we can't do the strategies and do the instruction and do the things that we did before. It's not going to move the needle. We're going to have to really start coming up with some innovative ways and teaching our teachers and helping them understand what those atypical and challenging behaviors look like and providing them with some supports, because that is the space that we're in right now. And quite honestly, we will be for a couple of years. That time of instruction and that time of social interaction during the pandemic, you can't just get that back. In a child development world, it's a use it or lose it time frame. So we've lost that development in children when they were 1 to 2 to 3 years of age during that window. So that's something that's really informing our professional development and some of the strategies with our teachers in those preschool settings. I'm sorry, Kristen, one more comment on that slide. You guys have copies of the slides here, but I do want to note one other thing at the bottom there. So the First Steps in Early Childhood Special Education programs do not do developmental screenings. And that's, I think, the last piece I wanted to mention that gets confusing sometimes. So physicians' offices, WIC offices, the parent education program in the school districts, or other home visiting programs that are out and about across the state. If families are concerned about their child's development, that's really the entry point. Get a developmental screening. Did you hit the cutoff scores? And sometimes it's not noticeable on those developmental screenings, but there's something odd going on or something atypical, or they couldn't even assess the behaviors on a screening. We might get those types of referrals, but many of the children that we're talking about in this space come to us through a physician or the parent getting a report to refer to early intervention or to early childhood special education.
Pam, just a quick question. If I understood you correctly regarding the screening, Parents as Teachers does screening?
Absolutely.
Okay.
They are,
they did.
yeah, they are our largest screener.
Okay.
Thousands and thousands of children a year. So that is our largest source of screening in the state as far as an educational setting.
And we'll get in, I think, in some of the discussion, some of the specifics about the tools that they use, et cetera, et cetera. But I don't want to interrupt at this point.
No, it's okay. I love questions, so feel free to jump in for any of our commission members. The other thing I wanted to mention real quick on that slide, sorry, Kristen, we didn't coordinate in advance of our nonverbals here, but the second part I wanted to mention is the other piece that we get a lot of questions around is really related to the other types of eligibility categories in the Part B or early childhood special education world. And there's some confusion around the difference between becoming eligible for autism. So that's going to be AU, and a lot of the data and a lot of the things that you see, the acronym for autism is AU, and emotional disturbance. And the acronym you'll see for that is ED. This is an awesome webinar that was recorded, like, I think just a few weeks ago, if I remember correctly. It was early April by the Office of Special Education in the department. And it steps out what's the same, what's different, what does that mean? So if you've got someone asking questions around the differences with that, I think that's really important. And it's great information. It's very user-friendly information to have. The other thing that I wanted to mention is many times in First Steps in particular, but sometimes in early childhood special education, we don't have a diagnosis at this age. We're under age 6, we're under age 3, and we will do our best to get children in through the developmental delay. And there's a caveat to that, and many of you know this, but it's called professional judgment in early childhood special education, and it's called informed clinical opinion in First Steps. And those are federally required alternative pathways to get to eligibility criteria in situations where the child wasn't able to be tested with certain behaviors, the child wasn't able to respond to certain standardized testing. We know with this population that we're talking about, they're hard to test sometimes, or sometimes their one-on-one interactions show a decent test result, but that's not what it looks like in peer situations with other children. So that's called conflicting information or discrepancy in what you're seeing in your structured observations and what you're seeing on test scores. That's a case for having that professional judgment or informed clinical opinion. So sometimes if there is a magnitude of information or results that show that, we can get them in under that developmental delay. And then maybe the family wants to be referred for a full medical diagnostics or something like that. But I think that's important to know for developmental delay. Okay, so I mentioned this just briefly, but we have a great graphic that we developed over the past maybe 18 months. I don't know if Dr. Soul's on here, but we worked with the Missouri chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics for, gosh, probably the last 2 years. I was able to sit in on our last meeting and it was fabulous. Just great conversations with our team members in the office and with the members on that chapter, and talking about help us understand what this referral process is and where are those entry points for families with children. Who do they go to when they say they're concerned that something's just not right with their child's development? So this is a great graphic that walks you through that. I'm not going to spend time doing that, but it's really a flow chart of the process of we're connecting with families and providing them basic information about their child's development. We really promote CDC Learn the Signs, Act Early. They have I don't know if any of you are familiar with this, but they have the app, the development tracker app. Sorry, I got that mixed up. And parents can download that on their phone, and each day and each week and each month, they get a little reminder of where their child should be. It's fantastic. So I have to insert here. I'm a mom of 4 sons that are grown, and I have my first grandbaby girl. So I'm super excited. I waited 29 years to get a little girl, and she's 10 months right now. And that we use the tracker, and this is kind of an age thing, I think, as well, because many of our young moms in their 20s, they like to have that type of resource. So where our parent educators may not be getting in the home with them, they're giving that resource to the parents. And at the end of the day, it's about educating the parents on your child's development. It doesn't matter how that happens. It can happen through an app. It can happen through an educator being in your home. It can happen in the community. But that is the first step, is educating where that child should be. And I think and I use it with my own granddaughter, and it's a great resource to just have that comfort level. The second step then becomes, maybe we want to get a full developmental screening. Not all of our parents have a child development background or a education background and may not understand what some of those milestones mean. So where can we send families to get the screening that I mentioned earlier? Sometimes that screening puts them, within the cutoff range. And so there's developmental monitoring or maybe some surveillance, to use that more medical term, where we're watching and we're waiting to see if the child is going to develop. Every child's different. And that's, I think, where we can get stuck. Because sometimes you'll get stuck in developmental monitoring. Let's wait and see. 3 months go by, 6 months go by. At some point in time, we can't stay in the developmental monitoring world very long. Every day is a big day for a baby. And so we have to really make sure as professionals that we're taking a look at how long is too long and what are those real atypical things that we don't do developmental monitoring. When it's atypical development, we need to go straight to more formal assessments. And then last but not least is that formal assessment piece. And that typically is a referral to one of First Steps or Early Childhood Special Education to see if the regular activities and strategies you're doing aren't enough, then you might need to have special education. So just to step back for a minute and we took a deep dive there into special education. I want to wrap up by just saying, so as you can see, even across this system of early childhood, where do families come in? Where are those critical touch points that they're getting an opportunity to learn about their child's development or make those referrals for different programs? And so looking at that and figuring out, we don't have the right access points or we don't have enough slots to fill families' concerns. So there's a lot of things around access. And then when you really think about that identification, how do we get them into a place that can get them evaluated more formally when need be? And then I was on the rapid response team for several years in the mid-2000s when Janet Farmer and the MU Thompson Center was really talking about early identification. And so I say this when it comes to timely services, because we talked in that group, I was there for maybe 6 or 7 years on that committee, and we talked in that group about we are doing a disservice to families if we identify without interventions. So if we're going to identify, What's the second part that comes after that to say, and here are the resources for you. Here are the strategies to help your child and family. It's critical. And we don't have that right now. We have it in places and pockets, but we don't have it where we need it all of the time in some cases. And then I think the last piece to really think about is our ultimate goal in our Office of Childhood is we're trying to do the things to get the children ready for school. School readiness starts at birth. And so and if you think of like, I kind of think like Price is Right and the Plinko game, and you put your chip at the top and no one does a straight line. I don't think I've ever seen that in the many years of watching The Price is Right. It's like, there's always at least a little jag. And sometimes there's a jag that takes you all the way to the other side of the Plinko and you get like 0, I think. But I use that analogy because that's life. You put that chip at the top of Plinko, you're not going to get the same result every single time. Every child's different. So we have to figure out what is that proper fit at the right time for that child in order to have that trajectory into school readiness happen. And so I just want to let you know, we've been really telling everyone about our 4 big goals. So taking those challenges and then looking at increasing access for children across all these places that they go before they get into kindergarten, improving the quality. We know that just putting a child in a classroom seat isn't going to produce positive outcomes, period. You have to have developmentally appropriate practices and proper instruction. Babies don't learn like adults. Children that are age 3 to 5 don't learn like children that are in 8th grade. So we have to really look at what's appropriate for how children learn. Then we want to start talking about recognizing that the state can't do this by ourselves. Our Office of Childhood is one piece of this very large puzzle. And as a practitioner many years ago, where the real work happens is what's happening in your communities. So we have a whole big initiative on our community leaders really emphasizing and encouraging and enhancing early childhood programs to make connections at the local level. And then really that feeds what we're doing at the state level. This is not a top-down approach. This is figuring out what they need in their different communities. And then last but not least, I wish Carrie was here because she would probably agree with this, but at a state level, we can't do the things we need to do if we don't have modern systems and efficient processes. And so we've got several strategies around modernizing our data systems, using that data to make informed decisions. My poor team members hear me say all the time, I don't have enough information to make a good decision. Can you give me some data? And so we need to really foster that culture within our state agencies and respond to what the data is telling us and make better decisions with that and be more efficient with our time. So that's another series of big goals. It's another meeting probably, but it's really important to us to be able to serve kids and to serve families as best we can. Thank you, Kristen. You did fantastic. So I know that's a lot to digest, just a day in the life of Pam, but I think that it not only shows you what this big world of early childhood is and where all the families are entering and exiting, but taking that deep dive into when we've identified concerns, what are we going to do about it? And how do we do that in a way that it makes a seamless process and transition for families? Because they just know they have a child they're worried about, and we have to figure out how to help them out along the way. So thank you again for the opportunity to share the information. Happy to follow up and discuss more. I'm sure folks have questions, but thank you.
So let me just open the floor for questions. Some of us swim in this water pretty regularly, even though Pam and I live on different coral reefs, we both swim in the same water pretty regularly. So a lot of these things are more familiar to me based on my clinical work. So I have some questions, but I don't want to lead with those. So I think for those of you who may not swim in exactly that water and have other questions or comments, I think this would be a great time to bring those up.
Steve does.
Hello, Steve.
Well, hi, how are you? First of all, I'm thrilled to be able to work with Pam on this next section of our work. But I did have a question, Pam. I was struck, I didn't realize that the consolidation into the Office of Childhood was really relatively so recent. And I'm wondering if you could share with us whether or not there's still transition efforts that need to happen in terms of maybe moving staff or moving programs that may impact some of what we're talking about here in terms of making recommendations, any bumps along the road that you might still, that the offices are still grappling with as services and programs are being consolidated.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. And I think we've passed the period of time that we are learning something new every day. So that might have been the first 6 months in the office transition. So I think we're kind of settling in from the space of special education in that sense. I think we're where we are going to be as far as the structure of our office. We have a great relationship with our Office of Special Education and what those requirements and rules are. We help assist in changes that relate to the early childhood special education space. And in First Steps, that program's been pretty strong for some time, has a lot of parent engagement and provider outreach planned with that. So I think as far as like the office structure, we might move some data pieces into our office, but I think from the programmatic standpoint, we're in a pretty good place. Where a lot of our transitions are yet to be seen or still in the process is on the child care side. And so that's not as settled, and it won't be, as you know, if you think about a merger with businesses or change management, all the research will show you 2 to 4 years, and we're just now entering into our second year. So we've got some transitions there still and just learning all of the different processes. But I do think for our home visiting and our early intervention and early childhood special education, streamlining processes probably, but as far as staff and the work that we're doing, I think we're in a pretty good place.
In that context, could you give us a snapshot of the size of your staff and so forth?
Sure.
How many are within different groups, et cetera? How many
Yep.
people are you really working with?
Sounds great. I love numbers, so don't ask me to remember people's names, but I can remember numbers. So our office, prior to the Office of Childhood, our department had actually started an Office of Early Learning, and we started consolidating the department's early learning programs, and we had 19. We had 19 staff in that office that were department-specific programs. So First Steps, parent education, some of our quality initiatives, and preschool. We inherited 90 staff from the Department of Health and Senior Services for child care licensing, and 38 staff from the Department of Social Services under the subsidy and quality programs umbrella. Last year in the legislative session, we inherited 4 additional staff from that transition, and we have 10 additional staff for monitoring, subsidy, and some of that child care training activity. So we're right now sitting at 168. So it was a big lift going from 20 to 168 in that time span. I do want to give a shout out to all of our staff because our current vacancy rate is 3.6% in our little office. So we're really proud of that. We spent a lot of time talking about our culture, what we wanted this office to be, what we want it to look like, and how we support one another, because it is really hard work. So we're really happy about that. And as I think when I stepped in, Carrie was talking a little bit about some of the legislative process pieces. I do want to mention, kind of related to that, what's to come. As you may know, the governor had 3 early childhood proposals or initiatives this year. They're all 3 still alive, so to speak, in some way, shape, or form. That would expand our pre-K or preschool programming in public schools. It would also increase our child care subsidy rates, and it would provide a new child care tax credit program. And likely, we might be growing if those happen, just to administer new programs. So I say we can do about anything for children and families. Just give us a couple people and some direction. Point us where you want us to go, because it's a big space and there's a lot of families that need help. So that's really our ultimate mission, is to make sure that we're serving them as best as we can. Okay.
Any other comments, questions? So I think, thank you for putting all of this together and helping us understand. I think that it seems to me anyway to be a huge step forward in terms of the integration of these divisions into a single department. So congratulations for that. I think that offers a lot of opportunity. Couple of questions that I have. One is that, so I think you kind of walked in as we were bouncing this around. So how much autonomy do you have within your Office of Childhood in terms of, say, the criteria for early intervention that you've listed here? Let's say that there's a consensus of your leadership and literature and so forth that we ought to be looking at some different criteria. Can you do that?
Yes and no is the answer to that. For early intervention, specifically Part C of IDEA, there are federal requirements that we have to have certain types of conditions in our criteria. So there's 9 medical conditions that are general categories in the federal regulations that we break down with more specificity in the state regulations. So I'll give one example: chromosomal abnormalities. That's kind of a general category. Then we can break that down to specific conditions in Missouri that are automatically eligible. So that's one arm of the criteria. The other arm of the criteria is developmental delay, and it is that the federal government requires you to have criteria for developmental delay, but it is the state's discretion to set the level. So Missouri has been, since 1993, full implementation of the early intervention program. Has been a half-age delay. I was not in early intervention at that time. However, the history that I've learned is that was really established through a pilot program from 1988 to 1993, where it really was being piloted. And as you may know, in Missouri's history, the parent education program came out in, I believe it was 1986, 1988, when that became in statute for every school district to have a parent education program. Those programs established kind of what that looked like as far as criteria. So parent education does not have any criteria. It's universal. If you live in the school district, you can have access to developmental screening, to home visits that the parents choose the frequency. And also they have a group, what's called a group connection, which is, you might know this in your own communities, where the parents of families in that community come together and they do different activities sponsored by the school district. And then a resource. So there's information coming out in newsletter and different things like that. So it's a universal approach to families being able to access those services. And so then you look at, okay, if that's available everywhere, what becomes that referral for a child that has a significant delay or developmental disability, so to speak. So back when they set that at a half-age delay, and it has been that way. We've ran trajectories on what those numbers might look like if we went to a 40% delay or different things like that over the years. But there really hasn't been picked up by the department through our budget process or whatnot. I will tell you that we about every 5 years do a trajectory and a projection of the children that are eligible and what that looks like at a national level and with the census level. And I'll be honest with you, it's just been, as most programs, it's just been a trajectory that's in a positive direction. We're getting that study updated this year. So I'll be happy to share that with the commission when it is finished and we post that, because that will give us a trajectory for what's expected in the next 5 years. And Carrie may have mentioned this because I stepped right in the middle, but the 2 ways that, so that kind of answers the question about the eligibility requirement and what's federally required in the state requirements. But keep in mind, there's 2 ways that we often have changes in funding or changes in our state policies that are statutory. And that is through either something being proposed by legislature, or the department has a new decision item in our budget process, and we propose that change through our budget process, or we propose that change through a legislation change in the department. So those are kind of the 2 avenues that we take to do that. So hopefully that's similar to what she said as well.
Do you know you've got good numbers here around the numbers of children. So how many eligible Missouri children participate in the parent education program? You know, percentage wise?
So we have to break that down a little bit. We have developmental screenings, and then we have home visits. So families can participate in different ways. I do know I just peaked, so I haven't had a minute to put this into my brain, but we just peaked at our preliminary numbers for developmental screenings, and it's around 75,000. Don't quote me on that, but about 73 to 75,000 developmental screenings a year through the parent education program. And then I believe we have around 200,000 plus home visits that are being done with families throughout that year. Most of our families get 3 to 5 home visits a year. And so we haven't set those numbers just yet, so those are preliminary. We'll do that through our budget process in June and July as we close that out.
Presumably a child could have more than one developmental screening.
Yes, but I believe that's an unduplicated count.
So 75,000 children. And eligibility for the parent education program, what is the age range?
It is birth through kindergarten entry. So once they begin kindergarten, they're no longer eligible. And so we do have referrals from the parent education program going into early childhood special education because they are a referral source for that as well.
So if your N is 450,000 of children in Missouri birth to age 5, and you're touching 75,000.
Correct. So I do want to make a caveat because we've been looking at this at the national level. We don't have a goal of 100% of children being served in our programs in the office, just in general. We recognize this is one avenue, but families may want to go to their physician or families may want to go to their WIC office. And so those are in different data collection systems that we don't know necessarily that they are getting that at this point in time. Now, in a dream world, it would be wonderful if we could all figure out where children are and who's getting those numbers. And then together in a collective group, we would be able to say 100% of children are getting that service somewhere. But for our office, we don't have the goal of 100%. We haven't really set a goal for the developmental screening for the number of children out of that 450,000, but we have for preschool, whether it's in a child care program or a public program, we can see from the national research that even in states with universal preschool programs, only about 65 to 70% of families take that offer. So they're still wanting to go to what we call family, friends, and neighbors. And that's okay as long as they're still getting that care and education somewhere. So even in those settings, so if I had to give a number today, I would say probably 60 to 70% of any of these voluntary programs that don't cost families to access is probably what we would get just based off what we're seeing in the preschool world. And I will also share that number drops as the children get younger. So when children are 4, we see more participation in screening and more participation in early learning programs. When they're 3, it's less. When they're 2, it's less. So you can see that kind of dropping off. And I think it's when your child turns 4, you're like, oh my goodness, next year's the year. We got to get going. And so we're trying to promote that happening before the child's 4, if that makes sense.
Just curious, you mentioned that a large portion of folks are getting that in-home daycare, friends, small unlicensed daycare providers. What level of education or training is going to those folks? Because they may be able to better identify delays. I don't know what your training looks like there, because to me that feels like maybe a big access point is, especially in like rural communities where there may not be doctors or that have as much experience with developmental delays or those like larger scale programs.
Okay, this is a question that is a 2-part answer. On one hand, unlicensed, unregulated childcare, we don't have a lot of contact with them. We don't know where they are because they don't have to report anything to us. They don't necessarily receive training from us. So that's in that category of they're 6 or fewer. They don't have to be licensed. And unless they've enrolled in the state subsidy program, they're not even like registered with us. So we get this question all the time. Where are all the children? And I can answer part of that question, but that's really up to those family, friends, and neighbors to address in that sense. So I don't know. They could be signed up for our stakeholder listing. They could be accessing information that way. I just don't know. The second part of that is for our licensed childcare programs or our contracted programs for subsidy. There are training requirements for health and safety. For license, they have to have 12 clock hours a year for each staff, and we have a menu of things they can take. So there is a little bit of a different training for that sense, but for the family, friends, and neighbors, I don't know what that space looks like.
Are there incentives for them to work with you? Like, are they able to get toys or books, or what are some of those things that kind of maybe would draw those folks to you? Because I'm thinking, I may not know that you exist, but if I had to go and learn from a training and I walked away with something tangible that I could provide, I may be more likely to go.
Yeah, professional development is a big one. And so we do provide quite a bit of either low cost or no cost training. I think the other part of that becomes, do you want to serve more than 6 children? So where you might have a grandparent, which I don't know if you've seen the trends in that, but grandparents retiring to watch their grandchildren, that trend is also in a positive trajectory. I say that and then my staff look at me and I'm like, I'm not leaving to go watch my grandbaby girl during the week, but I will on the weekends. But so I think there's that piece of it. And if I'm only doing that for my 2 grandchildren, I don't know if there's interest in expanding. If I'm serving 6 and I'm wanting to make that a business and I maybe want to go to 10, then you have to be licensed as a family home. And so then that becomes, do I want to take that step into a bigger space, or do I just want to go ahead and do that in case I grow my program? And right now, like many programs in the state, there's relief funding, and we've been able to put out startup grants and operation reimbursement, lots of things like that since 2020, late 2020. So there's been some of those incentives to help get started. There's community grants as well. So again, not just our office, we can't be all and end all for everything, but there's also community grants and some supports at the community levels that they can consider as well.
So thank you.
I think it's probably time we should take a little break and grab our lunch, and we can come back and we can certainly continue the discussion, and then we'll kick off a little bit after 1 o'clock, some of the phase 2 discussion that'll be occurring this afternoon. So Kristen, lunch is, oh yeah, for those online, please come back at 12, let's say 12:35. 12:35 our time, Missouri time.
And I did want to mention, I'll have to step out just a little before 2, so I didn't want to appear as if I was being rude and leaving, but I have another meeting at 2,
Sure.
so, but I can stay until then.
Great.
Thank you.
So the food is likely to be in a different room.
It is. So you will make a right out of these doors, then a left, and then another right immediately into that hallway. And it's lasagna, salad. There's a few, I think 3 gluten-free options for those of you that need those. So plates, forks, and options all should be ready for you.
So I do that a lot. I used to see like things from trail. It's the turn.
There you are.
Kick off again. I think a very productive agenda thus far, so thanks, everybody. So continuing with the launch that Pam gave us in terms of some background information, which I think is really valuable, and I'm sure we'll be discussing as we move forward through this project. Just to orient everybody, so you all know this, but let me remind you that our phase 2 project is early identification and intervention. And our responsibility is to look at children 5 and under, identify unmet needs, gaps, and prioritize such needs, and review best practices and develop goals to meet the needs of these children and families. Phase 2A Steve is going to give us an update in just a minute. Surveillance, screening, and diagnosis. Phase 2B, initiation and access to interventions for treatment, will be the project over the next few months. And then we still have in discussion phase 2C in terms of integration of care across settings, which certainly is a topic for discussion. How we're going to package that is not, I don't think we've truly decided that yet. But at the moment, we're moving into beginning phase 2B with an update on phase 2A. Here's where we are in terms of our sort of process. So commission meeting today, work group discussions, set the schedule for work group meetings, which will happen today. We're meeting 2 at 4 on this topic. And this is 2A, the process Steve is going to elaborate, which is definitions and settings where these services take place, best practices, and what we see at the moment is working well and can be improved. So everybody knows Steve Schonkoff, who's executive director at the Thompson Center in Columbia. So Steve, I'm going to hand this off to you.
Great. Oh, thanks. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah.
Does he want me to share or does he?
I can, Christian, if it's okay, I think I can share my screen from here and advance the slides. Does that seem to work for you?
That works. Thank you, Steve.
Okay. Well, assuming I share the right screen. Okay, let's see. And I'm going to try to start the slideshow. Can you see the slideshow view?
Yes.
Yes, we've got it.
Okay. John, just time-wise, because I'm in a bit of a different time zone here, I need to step off at about, what time is it there now? It's 12:35 or so?
Yeah, 12:35, 12:40.
I think I need to step off by about 1:15 your time.
Okay.
I apologize, but hopefully I can get through this and then that can set up some discussion and that we can, then Pam and I will be meeting when I return, and then that will set up the stage for the next set of meetings.
Sure.
So I'll just skip through this. We just talked about this in your update about where we are. And just what I thought I would do is just step through some of the discussions that the group has had. And just as a reminder, a little different than year one, we made the decision to consolidate 3 sections and work in sequence rather than parallel, so that we had opportunity for all who wanted to participate in these meetings. So, but I recognize that not everybody could understandably make all meetings. So this is a good opportunity for those who maybe were not able to make some of these discussions to look this over and add any comments, ideas, etc. I know I've shared out through OneDrive the written draft, if you will, that we have. I'll And Kristen, you just shared with me the other day an updated list of the committee members. So afterwards, either I can, or Kristen, if you want to, I can share just as an attachment to make it as easy as possible for everybody, the draft Word document and also these slides, which simply summarize some of those points. And then people can always follow up by email or in subsequent discussions as well. So what we set out first in the first part of these discussions was just to review some basic definitions, thinking that that would be a reasonable place to start for a report. The definitions for surveillance that we came to were processes that help observe how children grow and change over time, and define this as an ongoing process to help families recognize whether children are developing at a typical rate or whether there may be risks for developmental problems or delays, and pointed to the CDC definition of a flexible, longitudinal, continuous, and cumulative process at each health supervision visit to help identify children with developmental concerns. We did note, though, that even though the focus sometimes has been on healthcare surveillance, that surveillance can help in multiple contexts beyond simply primary care visits to also include home visiting programs, daycare and early childhood services, early intervention services, et cetera, and recognizing that surveillance is a less formal process than formal developmental screening methods, and that they also ideally engage parents in the process as well as partners in this, in these informal observations. So that was sort of the overview of surveillance. Okay. Screening, on the other hand, is here. I think there may be sometimes bright lines between screening and surveillance, but sometimes, lines may blur a little bit. But in general, screening is recognized as a more formal process that uses specific tools and measures to determine whether children are meeting developmental milestones. So these could include questionnaires completed by parents or other caregivers, structured observations that result in scores or formal ratings. And so these might be observational tools, for example. One thing we didn't discuss, but I wanted to note, is that I think the literature will be including more examples over time of the use of new methodologies to use archival data, electronic health records, tools that might aggregate information from disparate places to form algorithms that might be used to trigger further screening or evaluation. So in a sense, they may become additional sort of newfangled screening tools as those methods are researched and validated. So I thought that might be something useful for us to just recognize and anticipate as we write up these reports. So screening processes use standardized tools to assess for risk for developmental disabilities. And these might include tools that predict future development of a condition. So even when a diagnosis might not be reasonably present at a particular age, some tools might predict later onset of those conditions, or they may be used to identify children who may currently meet criteria for a condition. And we recognize that developmental screening tests and measures need to use specific methodologies and meet performance standards. So they need to be suited to a particular condition or outcome. They need to meet some criteria using performance metrics, including being sensitive to a condition, specific to the condition, and have positive predictive values that help provide evidence for efficiency of the screening tool, meaning that they predict an outcome, they have enough sensitivity for picking up on something that's really there, but not over-identify to such an extent that they overwhelm a system or unnecessarily create distress for families when a condition might not actually be present. They need to attend to feasibility and cost effectiveness, and tools need to address bias, so minimizing bias, such as avoiding over or under identification risk in a particular subgroup or specific populations. Like surveillance, screening can happen in a range of settings, including primary care, healthcare settings, parent educators, early childhood professionals, child care centers, preschool and school districts, et cetera. I say this recognizing that there may be some areas of discussion to understand what is feasible. Pam, you may want to, at some point, address something that you mentioned earlier in your presentation, which was that first steps or early intervention programs do not or are not conducting developmental screenings, and there may be maybe terminology differences that we want to make sure we're clear on so that people understand what screenings are taking place in which settings. So positive screens, that is failing a screening tool or a test, may then result in a referral for developmental and behavioral evaluations. And then these evaluations are used to determine appropriate diagnosis and to support subsequent referrals and treatment planning. And then the definition that we use for diagnostic evaluations is here. So these, I think we banded about various terminologies: developmental evaluations, neurodevelopmental evaluations, developmental behavioral evaluations, diagnostic evaluations. I think these terms in our discussions were used fairly interchangeably. They referred to processes that use comprehensive historical reviews and assessment of children's development and behaviors with the goal to identify any existing developmental disorder and development treatment plan. And one of the key concepts I think that we recognize is this concept of differential diagnosis, meaning developing a list of possible presenting problems, considering possible conditions that have overlapping symptoms, and conducting evaluations that are intended to clarify appropriate diagnosis. So those were the definitions that we commented on, and the thought was an initial report would provide context for readers of this report to understand what we're talking about when we're talking about surveillance, screening, and diagnosis in early childhood. I'll pause there. From anybody in the room, online, members of prior discussions, to see if you have comments or things that you think are sort of off base and were missed in the review so far.
I think, Steve, the one you called out earlier, which was with regard to services that are provided through parents as teachers, early childhood special ed, et cetera, et cetera. So as you said, I looked to Pam to be sure that under the surveillance and screening categories that we're defining things properly, or at least consistently. There's enough confusion out there. We don't want to add to it.
Yeah, so I'll jump in. I think that surveillance in our terminology in an educational world is really around that reference I made to developmental monitoring. And so I think that is aligning. And really for us, it's those informal tools that we're using to help families understand just basic developmental milestones. And where is my child at? Where should my child be? And like I mentioned earlier, that can come in a lot of different avenues. That's not really participating in one of our programs. And I did not put in the slides the link to the CDC developmental tracker. So I think there are some, Kristen, if you remind me, I could get a couple of links to this group so they can kind of see what informal tools I'm talking about when I'm talking about that parent education developmental monitoring piece. When it moves to a developmental screening, the language I was looking at on the slide there, I mean, I think that's appropriate. It is using a tool. You do have cutoff scores. It has to meet certain properties to be called a developmental screening tool. So we have some that might be a scan or some that might be more informal, but to meet that definition of a screening tool, then you have to have certain properties that go into that. So from what I've seen thus far, I think you're spot on, Steve. I think we might need to flush out when we get to the next step of evaluation versus assessment, because that tends to kind of get a little confusing. But if we can align surveillance and in terms that you'll see on our website as far as developmental monitoring, and we can agree that there are certain properties with developmental screening that we want to make sure they're using appropriate tools for the age of the child and the concern. I think I don't see much discrepancy there, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think as we go through the next slides, I think the question I had will come up in terms of what types of additional screenings should, can, or cannot take place, for example, in early intervention or first steps programs. And that, so maybe we'll just put a sort of park that for a second, because I think that might be a really useful discussion as we move forward, just to make sure that we can align recommendations for what's realistically feasible, right? And align terminology there as well. So I think your input will be really important there.
Do others in the room have any comments or questions for Steve or Pam before he moves on? That seemed pretty clear. Great. Yeah, a lot of nodding heads, Steve.
Good. We like nodding heads. So the next part of our discussions were really to think about strengths in our system, weaknesses, and opportunities that might help us lead to more specific recommendations. And I just preface this by saying that I really appreciate the recommendation list that was offered earlier for the transition topic. So we're not there yet, but this is a working document that we'll be able to use. I think the model that was done in the first year to get there with more specific recommendation lists. In terms of the surveillance and screening, I just tried to summarize some of the common themes that came up in our discussions around strengths and weaknesses and opportunities. So in the area of strength, it was recognizing that there are varied points of contact for families in Missouri, including primary care providers. Kristen Soul, if you're still on, I think you shared that you estimated somewhere between around 40% of children might be seen in family medicine clinics, whereas around 60% in pediatric clinics, recognizing that those might be seen by MDs, DOs, nurse practitioners, whoever the appropriate primary care provider might be. As Pam's mentioned several times, there is universal access to parents as teachers, and that's an opportunity for the state to capitalize on. Health insurance coverage for children has improved in Missouri. And these numbers come from a study I found by the Kaiser Family Foundation, improving from 92.5% in 2008 to over 94% in 2021. Early intervention, first steps in early childhood systems are an additional setting for screenings, and this may be just where we need to clarify some terminology based on what we think is appropriate for screenings for those settings. The state of Missouri's Early Connections program has consolidated information on early childhood surveillance and screening programs and family navigation within the system. So some real strengths in Missouri that can be built upon. Some areas of weakness or yes,
Steve,
please.
can I jump in real quick on the strengths? I just have a couple of maybe clarifications. Is bullet item number 2 and 4 the same thing or something different?
I think they were meant to be probably the same thing, only to build on 3 should have been right under 2 as sort of a sub point, I think.
Okay. So that's referring to the Parents as Teachers Parent Education Program that's through the school districts across the state?
I believe that was the comments in our discussion.
Okay. Thank you. That helps.
Does that make sense to you, Pam?
Yes, I think it struck me for a minute since they were in 2 different lines, but I think given universal access and that it is widely available, I think, and surveillance equaling developmental monitoring, that all makes sense. Then I'll skip the one on the screening piece that you mentioned. We'll come back to that. And then the last one I wanted to just clarify is the Early Connections program. the earlyconnections.mo.gov website or something else?
I took that to mean the website because those are the links that were provided in our discussion.
Okay. Yes, and
Is
so
that
I
a,
can,
is that an appropriate way to put that, you think?
I think just, well, it's not a program in the sense of the parents as teachers program. So when you have the 4th bullet and the 6th bullet in the same listing, it almost looks like they're a program. So Early Connections being a website, it's a resource, but there isn't someone that's going to come to your home. You're not going to get the same things you would get in a program. So I think maybe even just the state of Missouri Early Connections website has consolidated information, and that is where you can get access to the CDC tracker. You can go through the developmental milestone steps yourself as a parent and get the resources. So I love that you put that in there. That's great. But I just want to make sure that the reader doesn't think that's a program.
Yeah, that's a good clarification for terminology. I think it may be program on some of the web pages and not others, but for our context, that's an important clarification. So I'll make note of that. Some areas of weakness or sorry, John, any other comments? Okay. We recognize that there is not always even access to primary care. Although insurance coverage has increased, Missouri still ranks 37th out of 50 in the percentage of children with health insurance coverage. So things have improved, but there's always sort of areas for improvement there, and that impacts access to screening if you have access to primary care. There's a lot of discussion for the need and opportunity for ongoing provider trainings to support linkages, both to trainings to conduct appropriate surveillance and screening, but also to translate the results of those processes into referrals for evaluation. There was a lot of our discussion, as I recall, that was focused around parents as teachers in that, but I took that to mean not to pick on that program specifically, but rather to say anywhere there is surveillance and screening that is happening, there's opportunity to increase quality and consistency of these services through additional trainings. In that there's the need to support improved consistency of access across the state, especially in underserved regions and communities. Again, a lot of the discussion was around rural communities, which is obviously very appropriate for Missouri, but I would venture to guess that underserved, more urban communities have similar and overlapping challenges. We talked a lot, there were a lot of discussion about the complexities related to uptake and eligibility for first steps. This, I think, echoes some of the questions that, John, you had earlier in terms of how much leeway or not the First Steps program has in terms of changing their eligibility criteria. And the yes and no answer earlier was really very informative, so we have to just recognize those complexities. We recognize that there are opportunities to deliver treatment and supports and education for children and families in the time between screening positive and diagnostic evaluation. So in other words, this, I think, anticipates a weakness on the next set of slides too in the areas of diagnostic evaluations, where you may have a positive screen and referral for a diagnostic evaluation. But as we all know, there are long wait times and there are opportunities to support families during those wait times. And I think we talked about those opportunities both in the context of screening programs, but also in terms of the centers that are doing diagnostic evaluations. Those are the major themes that I abstracted from our conversations in terms of weaknesses and opportunities. And we want to go through, I think after I get through these slides, maybe come back to these and talk about how we might begin to translate these into more operational recommendations. I'll move on to the next slide unless there are comments about this. Okay. then in terms of diagnostic or developmental evaluations, we recognize that there's a strong consortium of autism centers that deliver high quality evaluation services in Missouri, that there's been careful and extensive work in the past on developing best practices and for evaluations and differential pathways for evaluations. And we can point readers to the MAGI report, which were done some years ago. There's an ongoing commitment from the state to support diagnostic centers, including support to address access to diagnostic services. The last one should be in the weaknesses. I probably ran out of room. I apologize. So we'll start here in terms of weaknesses and opportunities. That we recognize that there are inefficiencies in referral processes, long wait lists with children on often multiple wait lists was recognized as a weakness and opportunity. We came back to opportunities for perhaps an improved statewide referral process, some centralization of that process to help navigate families to the right center in the most time efficient way, but recognize that could come at a cost and requiring probably a sizable investment. There are multiple weaknesses that I think are not specific to Missouri, but that we need to recognize, including an insufficient number of providers to meet a growing demand for diagnostic evaluations. The challenge for all centers in Missouri and nationally as well to recruit and train new providers for diagnostic services. That these challenges are not solely the result of, but certainly influenced by low reimbursement rates for behavioral health care services. Recognize that there's an uneven geographic distribution of autism centers across the state that may poses a challenge for families in more rural and outlying regions. That there are opportunities to improve the quality and consistency of some of our services. There was some discussion, for example, of opportunities to have trainings for how to deliver difficult news or uncertain news as the result of the diagnostic evaluations, opportunities to improve the translation of diagnostic evaluation results into actionable, inappropriate, and feasible recommendations. Harkening back to the prior slide, the need to enhance while you wait services for children referred for evaluations, but where they're waiting on wait lists. And refining eligibility for criteria for treatment programs as we start to think about children exiting evaluation services and entering into treatment programs to make sure that those are appropriate and aligned with the evaluation and recommendations that are happening. Two additional themes that were raised in our conversations. One was a recognition that systems of care are fragmented and that this limits access and can get in the way of collaboration on behalf of children and their families. And that there's a need for the commission to present actionable in near-term recommendations, as well as perhaps thinking of larger issues that might be take more time to address. Some additional recommendations that were raised for areas of surveillance included improved consistency of surveillance across settings, the potential for a more systematic statewide surveillance program was raised with questions around who organizes and coordinates that, how do trainings across settings happen. It's been mentioned already several times that there are links to a CDC checklist and information, but we recognize that there's the Act Early CDC state level efforts that can be very helpful and supportive here that we want to recognize and appropriately link to. In terms of screening, additional conversation was raised around potential opportunities to track who gets screened to help increase coverage and decrease duplication of services. An idea was raised to consider whether there could be a population health approach that might approximate the Show Me Vac system to help ensure that children are receiving screening services and that there's some organized way to track that and then act upon those results. And an additional, perhaps alternative idea was whether there's an incremental or quote opt-in option for consistency of access to share results of screenings, for example, using existing programs of First Steps and early childhood services. And I apologize for any typos in this PowerPoint. And I apologize for sliding through all these quickly, but I figure I'll just go through them and then it'll open up opportunity for discussion. An additional, I think, bigger idea that was raised was what was termed a 4-layer model, beginning with broad surveillance and monitoring programs, casting a wide net, and a broad and sort of a gradually funneling system that triages children to specific screenings, with screening results helping to triage to appropriate levels of care, where some evaluations potentially could take place in healthcare and or educational settings, where some diagnostic work potentially can be done that's not being done currently. And then feeding more complex cases to autism centers to help manage the ever-increasing set of referrals that autism centers are seeing with increasing wait time. So this idea was raised as a way to help think about perhaps a broader conceptual model to increase more rapid access to appropriate care and funneling more complex cases to more tertiary care type centers. And we already talked about those next steps in terms of what's going to happen, but I thought I'd just end there. I'll linger on this last slide and just open to conversation about where we might go with recommendations. And one thought would be to ask those in the room or online what we can think of, perhaps recommendations that have a near term, we can do these recommendations within current systems type of approaches versus bigger picture, longer term ideas that might take more organizational stamina and perhaps funding and budgetary efforts to accomplish as well, because I think both might be reasonable to include in a report, but we might want to differentiate those in our recommendations. So that's the summary of our discussion so far.
Great, thanks,
So
Steve.
John, I thought we'd just, open up to conversation from there.
Yeah, thanks for organizing and putting that all together. That was a lot of work in and of itself. So thank you very much for doing that. And thanks to everybody that contributed. There's a lot of thoughts in those slides. So let's open it up to discussion or comments or questions to see what other people think about what's being suggested and any ideas that you may have about potential, I guess, to set up the discussion on recommendations when appropriate. So let's start first with the discussion around this surveillance screening and diagnosis model, which is sort of a description of what exists, I think, around the state. So thoughts or questions while we still have Steve on the phone about those issues?
I just have one thought in the earlier recommendations that we looked at today, revision of the MAGI documents was one of the discussions. And I think this is more enhanced when you talk about surveillance than what's probably in those documents. So just to keep in mind that if we're going to circle back to that, including this would be helpful.
Any other thoughts or suggestions?
This is Pam, and I just wanted to jump in, and as I was listening, I was just wondering, and maybe this has been something that's been done and I'm not familiar with it, but I always start with what exists now. Like, I don't want us to start like duplicating or reinventing the wheel. So I just was wondering, has there been some sort of a gathering of the state agencies and the programs that provide these types of services? What's the age of the children? What's the service they provide? What's the eligibility criteria? Like, has there been some of that type of mapping that's been done? And maybe that becomes a near-term activity, because I feel like I can't plug the hole if I don't know where the gap is. And I think sometimes, and I'm just sharing from our office transition over the last couple of years, what we learned is we made a lot of assumptions. We assumed we knew what that program did. We assumed we knew this, and we thought there was a gap, but there really wasn't. There was an overlap, and we just needed to better streamline that activity or streamline that service to be able to have an increased access to it. So my mind was going with, do we really know what we know? Do we know the landscape of services for families that we're talking about here? And maybe that does exist somewhere, but I think we would need to go across agencies maybe to do that.
Which explains why you're here. I think that your expertise in helping us understand particularly what's going on at the state level is key. You know what you're trying to do and you know what you're doing. If you look at the two groups, so I think your involvement in that, and perhaps involvement with other state agencies that you may be aware of that are involved in these programs, is going to help us establish that landscape, if you will.
Okay.
I think in terms of the healthcare side of it, we have some data regarding certainly screening processes. It is hard to get state-specific data, as you would imagine. We do have national level data, and we do have some input from our Missouri AAP colleagues and Missouri Academy of Family Medicine colleagues, but it tends to be more qualitative than quantitative. So I would just simply say that I think on the health, so I'm thinking about, and maybe I'm missing a third part, I'm thinking about what the state of Missouri is already doing in these active areas through its multiple departments and programs, many of which funnel through your department, and what healthcare providers are doing. Is there another area?
I guess that's kind of where I was going as well. So are there screening and developmental monitoring or surveillance activities that are happening outside of the early education world I presented and the health arena that you mentioned? So within our, and I just go to the concept of health, social services, mental health, education. There could be, and I'm just not familiar with that, but I think that's at least a question we should ask to make sure that we've got all the players in that arena. I think the second thing to think about is non-state funded entities, and this kind of gets to the conversation we had earlier, and Head Start is a huge part of that world. Federally funded Head Start's not in our office. We work very closely with them, but they do developmental screenings. And a lot of times they contract with school districts to provide some of that instructional time, classroom setting, developmental screenings. And so I know that data collection process is kind of fragmented, but they have reporting requirements around that. So they're collecting that in all of the grantee programs at some level. And I'm not the expert on that. I know just enough to be dangerous, but I think that we just need to be thinking about, if we really want to get a comprehensive look at this, we have to make sure that we've at least scanned the landscape to know where those touch points are and that we've got them somehow on the list, even if the data is not quantitative, to know that they're part of that mapping, so to speak. But that's I think something that I want to make sure that we could be. Again, we're not the end all be all. There could be other players.
Who does Head Start? Who collects the data for Head Start?
So I believe
in the state of Missouri.
I believe somebody may know this better than I do, but I believe it's the Missouri Head Start State Collaboration Office helps coordinate some of that. But the grantees I believe, each individually have to collect that data for their programs. And then I'm not sure where it gets funneled up. Anybody in here? But we can find that out.
Yeah.
Stacy Wright at MU, where the state Head Start collaborate, Missouri Head Start State Collaboration Office, I have to say that all in sync, is located on MU's campus. So I think we can reach out and maybe have a connection there, but.
Well, I'll ask others in the group whether they're aware of other entities, and I would simply express my bias, which I'm quite certain there are. I don't know how, this is an unknown unknown.
It is.
How do we find out about that?
Well,
And so
and I
that's
think
tricky.
it is tricky. And like I said earlier, you know, some of those entities are private and they should be and will be, but for those federally or state funded programs, so where they have to publicly report, they have to do these types of activities to get federal and state funding. Let's just start there. Let's just start with those that are in that world and just make sure that we have everyone. And then I think that non-public domain, so to speak, is always going to be a challenge, and we won't have all of them, but if we just even want to start with state, let's just start with state. You know, maybe going to other entities might be a challenge, but.
Well, and certainly, and I know Steve can help with this, and other friends in other places can as well. So I can go to our team and simply ask them, tell me, where are these kiddos being funneled from? Who is actually sending us stuff? Which will at least give me a snapshot of some places. And you can obviously do the same for Mid-Missouri, and we can talk to Cy and our friends in Kansas City about what they know, and our friends in SEMO, et cetera. So I think we can get, just through our consortium of autism centers, a pretty quick snapshot of how accurate are we in thinking these are the sites where this work is going on, and who have we forgotten about. So we can take that as a to-do, I think, that may help with that question.
And then I would ask in Department of Mental Health, are there services for children that have developmental disabilities or autism that's not on the map, so to speak, right now, that we just need to at least recognize? I know we have an agreement for our children birth to 3, but when they get into that early childhood special education space, early childhood special education services in a school district is not the only option. So if we're really going to present to families and to professionals those options, I just want to make sure we've identified the services that are available for children of that age.
One thing that came up in a lot of our discussions, not just where screening happens, but included how we want to support continuing education and training to support the consistent use of appropriate screening tools, sort of the competencies of how screening happens within various settings. And Pam, to your point, there may need to be some data collection about what, even within the state systems, is happening across these varied settings. And one service that this commission might be able to do, and this report might be able to offer, is just a common language to make sure that when, if we recommend that there be some more data collection to evaluate where we are currently, that we're comparing apples to apples across these different agencies that might be doing different or sometimes overlapping work. So that might be a good thing for us to do as well.
And I'll jump in. You know, I saw Shelley Reynolds' name on the list of the last report, and I know they're charting the life course activity has maybe done some of this. So it could be that this has already been done and been identified, that we just need to, it's been a minute since I've looked at that, so maybe we just need to kind of refresh ourselves. And this is going to really date me, but back in the day, there used to be kind of that system of care website, I think, that was at least active during the Rapid Response Committee work. I don't know if that's something that's still active that has the different services mapped by the age. I'm sorry, Carrie and Kristen, you're like, but and so I know we provided a lot of resources to that, and it was kind of like a pathway, and it was through the Office of Autism, and it had different types of services and ages. So I think I'm not, again, trying to reinvent the wheel, but I think for just a moment, let's stop and make sure we have the the landscape of what that could be. And it could just be as a matter of just resurrecting some of the work that's been done by someone else.
All good suggestions. Others? Thoughts? Well, you make a good point, which is it's hard to know how you're going to get somewhere if you don't know where you are. So I think trying to figure out where we are makes sense. And I don't know, Carrie either knows or can access for us information from DMH about the work that they're doing, I suspect, or you may be able to do that in terms of the other challenge that we have here. It's not a huge challenge, but we're now speaking about development in a generic way. We're looking at the overall development, and that's actually what's important. We all believe, as in transition to adulthood, we believe that this is not a specific need for only individuals with a diagnosis of autism, correct? So all of this general information is going to be useful. But we have a separate charge, I think, in the context of the commission to think about how this applies to autism. And so, for example, using the data you presented earlier, 450,000 children 5 and under, that would be about 11,200 or so very likely to be on the autism spectrum according to Missouri specific prevalence data. So are we talking about what we need for 400,000, or are we talking about what we need for 15,000? And so I think that we're talking about both, but I think it's important that we distinguish the way to identify that 2%, 2.5%, take your preference, of those which meet criteria is we have to start with the big group. And then we have to figure ways. And for every child with autism, there is at least 2 or 3 children with significant developmental conditions which are not autism. So, you can use, if you use the 11% number or use the 17% number, whatever number you need, children with special health care needs, some of those are things that require developmental services, some are not. For example, asthma and high-risk allergies and other things. But all of that becomes relevant too. So our N becomes important. The processes that are available for the broad developmental considerations, and then how those processes connect to triage children into developmental treatment processes, and then further triage children into autism-specific therapies. So again, I see that as something we're going to be thinking through.
I in my mind just laid out the report, because the 2 parts is that general screening or that general surveillance, that piece of the screening for all children. But then the second part becomes the specific things once we do have that identification that we would be doing, and then you slice it by age. To me, it's almost like a chart that has, here's the general things, here's the services and the programs that are available for children at these different ages. But now let's talk specifically about children where they have a diagnosis of autism and what is available to them at those different time frames. Like, I think those are both important pieces to not just educate professionals, but to have available to support families in a way that's easy. It's kind of hard for us sometimes to do in a way that's family friendly, but I think that, and I don't know if Steve's still on, he is, but I think that to me is ultimately the goal, because families enter into these programs in so many different places and ways. So we have to have something that identifies that larger top part of the funnel as well as how they got to the end, or you're gonna have a problem with identification if you don't have that larger landscape available.
The other point then is that the need of the child based on the developmental screening and diagnostic testing is obviously going to be different. But so evidence-based treatments for children with speech language delay and evidence-based treatments for children with autism are not the same. And so how we think about interventions, and then how we hold ourselves and other stakeholders accountable for the opportunity to provide those interventions that tend to be either general or more specific, becomes relevant. So the medically complex children with genetic disorders and autism require a level of care which is different from a child without that degree of medical complexity, genetic need, et cetera. So all of this, so that funnel idea works, I think, as we begin to piece it together and look for opportunities. Steve?
I think there are a couple of things that we want to to keep in mind as well, based on this conversation. One is that some things we write might end up being informational that help the community navigate to the right things, know what's available, et cetera. But we also want to affect change for the better. And so we, also want to make some specific recommendations that are going to take some effort and probably cost some money potentially, that can improve things. So from the point of view of screening, it seems to me the big issue is making sure that screening happens as universally as possible, and that there is a place for positive screens to go for evaluations, right? And from the evaluation standpoint, we want to make sure that there's increasing access to the evaluation so that we, through various tools, decrease wait times where we can and increase access to those services. And then the next set of conversations over the next several months will really tackle, I think, the issues around access to treatment services after evaluations. But I say that to just ask the question about what people might think of two sort of bigger picture ideas that were raised in our discussions. One was, well, actually three bigger picture ideas. One on the screening side, the development of a resource that would centralize information on which children receiving services, screening services, and on the diagnostic side, program that might centralize referrals so that families can be navigated to appropriate centers that might be close to them, have openings, and reduce the likelihood that, not eliminate, but reduce the likelihood that multiple families are on multiple wait lists. And then third, this more formal funnel idea, which John, you just alluded to, and one critical piece of that discussion was at level 3 of the funnel, I think, was the assumption that more evaluation services, meaning more diagnostic decision-making, could take place in settings such as First Steps or early childhood education centers, which is not happening so much right now. The diagnostic services are taking place in the autism centers or to some extent through the ECHO program where children are referred to those providers. So those are three bigger picture ideas that might take actually a revamping of services and bigger devotion of resources. And so I'm just curious where people stand on those sort of ideas.
Well, I'll jump in and I want to make sure that we're using the same words. So I guess I should have introed. I'm not really shy to talk about this important topic, so apologies. But when you say diagnostics, I think what you're referring to is testing in order to determine the diagnosis of autism.
Correct. Or ruling out autism, right? So
okay.
Determining the presence or absence of autism.
Okay, so we run into a bit of a challenge with that in IDEA because that's not necessarily a funded activity in IDEA. So diagnostic, that type of a diagnostic evaluation isn't funded unless it's critical for eligibility because the other pathways are not working. So if you can't do a developmental delay, you can't get to an agreement of a developmental delay constitutes eligibility, or you can't get to an agreement of professional judgment and informed clinical opinion. And I believe only Part C allows for funding for diagnostics for eligibility purposes. But many, like in my 15 years in early intervention as a practitioner and as the state coordinator, I'm only aware of 2 or 3 cases where we had to pay for the medical diagnostics in order to rule out the other categories, because with informed clinical opinion and professional judgment, you can determine that child's educational need requires special education. So my caution there would be, I think we might be asking a special education arena to do something that will not be within scope, and you'd have to find a different funding path to do that.
However, understanding that reality, this has been discussed previously. So medical practitioners, experienced psychologists, others who do diagnosis can use data from other places. So one of the reasons we're jammed up in our autism centers is because we do multiple diagnostic tests, evaluations for each child whom we see.
Okay.
If we partnered in such a way that we agreed, okay, the doc's gonna need this much, give the doc this testing, then let the MD, PhD, whomever, use that, not duplicate it, right?
Yep.
Apply the differential diagnostic model in which they're trained, and then give a diagnosis. That obviates the need for the school district to do the diagnosis, but partners, there's a partnership now in terms of the flow of data as opposed to a separation of data accrual.
Yes, so I think if I'm following you, the concept would be families that have already gone through the IDEA special education process have a plethora of information. They've had evaluations, they've had observations, etc. They can take that information and come over to that diagnostic side and share those reports, and with consent. So to clarify, for those two programs, we have to have parent consent before we can share anything about the child. But if we know they're interested in going to the autism centers, or if we know that they express that, sometimes it's asking the question, is there anyone I can send these reports to for you? Then we can get signed consent to share that and or discuss that with that autism center. And or on the flip side, if the practitioners at the autism center can ask, have you been involved with First Steps or Early Childhood Special Education? Have you had a test before? The parent can sign the consent for you. We can take that consent as permission as well. So I think that there's absolutely an opportunity. Many of these families have probably landed in one of those two programs on their pathway to get to the autism center. And we should be sharing that information so that you have that up front and not be duplicating the testing.
Well, and to be clear, we don't have trouble getting information because we always request it and families always authorize it. And we do get information from schools. So I don't want to imply that we don't get it. However, sometimes the criteria or the testing instruments that's used to qualify a child for First Steps does not really inform me to the level that I prefer, okay? Or that I feel confident with.
Yeah, so we're gonna have a little rub here. So one of the things that's required, so if we could take just a second maybe to talk about the tools while Steve is here. One of the things that's required, so let me back up. Screening, evaluation, there's different standards for the tools. So for a screening tool, it has to have all 5 developmental areas, and it has to have a parent interview and a observation component. The tools that our state recommends is generally ages and stages and the dial. Those are the top 2. We do also encourage the ages and stages social emotional, which is a separate screening tool. Then, and really, I think all of you know this, but it's just, your weight of parent interview is the same or more as what the tool items are. I think there's 5 to 6 items in each of those developmental areas. It's a screener. It's not extensive. When you move to evaluation, then you have to have that more rigor. And one of the things that makes it more rigor, as you probably know, is the training qualifications for the instrument. So in a screener, you don't have to go through a specific training and you don't have to have specific qualifications. When you get to the evaluation part, you do have to have a specific type of qualification and you do have to have a specific type of training to do it. And the tools have many more than 4 or 5 items on them. So it's a deeper dive into that, and you weigh more on what you're seeing with the child, and still parent interview, but not as much. So it's kind of a shift to a little bit more rigor. And in the state of Missouri for the early intervention program, the recommended tool is the Developmental Assessment of Young Children, or DAYC. It is on a developmental, educational perspective, and we do run into challenges in what is maybe needed in that more healthcare arena. So I think knowing that could help also structure some of the comments and the narrative and the reports that we provide for that when there is suspect or when the family does tell us that they might be going in to look for more information around autism. And I think one of the things that we talked about is the MChat, just as one example. We can't do that as a screener before determining eligibility, but we can do it alongside. So maybe that's something that could just be a recommendation, that if these 3 things are the concerns, in addition to your formal or your formal evaluation, could you also do the screener? Or something like that that provides more, that's just one example of more meaningful information.
And I think a healthy conversation about this from the different perspectives. So what's the goal of what the early childhood evaluators are trying to determine? What's the goal that we're trying to determine? They certainly overlap. Where can we enhance that? So as you would suspect, I don't find the DAISY particularly compelling in terms of correlation with the individual testing that we do. But if I get some objective psychometric testing done from the school district, it's equally reliable to that which we do in our own setting. So it often is the tool that's chosen, and the tool is chosen sometimes based on operator preference or operator capability or other reasons. But the point is, a healthy conversation about that probably buys us some capacity, and God knows we need some capacity in terms of getting these kiddos evaluated and moved on. So I think that's right there is a healthy opportunity for discussion.
I would add also that just to refine the terminology a little bit, the screeners that you mentioned, another way to use another terminology of the screeners might be that the screeners that you described, Pam, in my world, I describe them as developmentally general screeners. They're not specific to any one condition. The MChat, for all its positives and negatives, is designed to be a bit more specific, an autism specific screener, but it's not the only one, and there are others. And we might want to consider whether First Steps, for example, the EI program is an opportunity to do not as an eligibility for First Steps, but for children who are in First Steps where there is additional concerns about possible autism, a more specific autism screening. So it would be different than a developmental screening that you're using for eligibility purposes. But it might help refine who needs to be referred for diagnostic evaluations at an autism center and who does not. So to try to just sort of control that pipeline a little bit and offer just more specific referrals. So the MChat is one, but the MChat has its negatives. It's sort of what we use, but there are a lot of drawbacks to the MChat. But there are other to just anticipate something that you would raise. There are other what I'd call term second level screeners, meaning that they're not quite up to the level of sensitivity and specificity that would be required for a diagnostic measure, but they're more specific to autism than something like the ages and stages. So that would go beyond the MChat. It might include more performance measures where you have to train a staff person, a paraprofessional, or a therapist within early intervention, or it could be done in a primary care healthcare setting to do some things with a child that result in observational measures in a test result, like the stat that's used in the echo, some of the echo models, or a newer measure called the RETA-T, which has reasonably good psychometric properties that might help as a second level screener. The drawback being that they would require consistency of training and maintenance of that training for a setting. We have to really consider whether that's something we'd want to recommend.
Before we get too far down in the details, I want to open it up to have others comment or raise questions or concerns about sort of where we're going with this direction. So I think we've clearly identified that there will be an opportunity for conversation between healthcare providers, autism centers, and providers operating in your sphere as we move forward. I think that opportunity seems clear. That'll require some discussion. But a recommendation to integrate and enhance the relationship among those providers would already be a recommendation, I think. Methodology can be discussed. But Carrie, I think you had a point.
Yeah, that's where I was going. So if I remember correctly, some of our discussions from some of our work groups, there's some examples going on, I think, in the state of Kansas, where there is some collaboration between school districts and healthcare providers in what that diagnosis. I would also want to point out, because some of the things that we also hear is parents don't know the difference.
Exactly where I was going.
And so they think they've gone down this route with First Steps or with early childhood education, and they have their diagnosis, but they do not. They're two different things, and that's an area that we really have to address and be sensitive to. That yes, it's great in for early childhood and First Steps, and I don't want First Steps to require a diagnosis. That's exactly what they should do. You're this far behind. Let's bring you in and start getting working before we know what's going on. But parents don't fully understand that they don't have what they think they have when they go through that process. And for DMH, we have certain things that we look for. There's multiple different ways that people can qualify, but an autism diagnosis on the healthcare side, autism diagnosis is like the automatics. Like, oh, you've got that? Yes, you're eligible for services. Now we'll come in and figure out how your life is impacted and which services you need from us, as opposed to going the other way, which is much harder, where the families have to prove these are the areas of my life is impacted. This is how much my life is impacted. So can you please make me eligible to receive services from DMH? And it's a much harder process.
So I'm just gonna flip it around, Carrie, because it's easier in education to just get the developmental delay. Absolutely. And get them in and get the services. And it's not that the diagnosis isn't important, but for some, I'm gonna tag on the sensitive part of that. For some families, they are not ready. Absolutely. And we can actually, we've seen this happen, if we trigger that too quickly, they will stop getting the services in that education world because they're not ready. So it's that relationship building that, depending on how far they've gone down that path of developmental monitoring and screening and building a relationship with the person that's coming in their home, if they haven't had a lot of that, it's tricky. Mm-hmm. And so we just have to be careful that when the family says, I want to take this further, I think I need to go see someone in that healthcare arena, in that diagnostic arena. We need to make sure our people are ready to provide that, because I don't know that everyone knows where to go or how to refer them for that when they're ready, and or how to encourage them if that's something that they're seeing. It's that delicate balance. And so even having recommendations around how to do that for both sides of that line, I think would be helpful.
Yeah, I agree.
Can I step in, John, for a second, just because I need to step off?
Sure.
And Pam, I agree that all recommendations need to leave room for skilled one-on-one work with families that meet them where they're at, and so you can't be too prescriptive because you need to let the relationships really work. That's really important. Just the one thing I'll just end with, and I need to step off, is in terms of use of capitalizing on programs like First Steps for autism-specific screening, just to use that terminology for a moment. One thing that I'm actually not sure about is the proportion of children who do have a diagnosis of autism who actually received early intervention, First Step services, and of those who did, when were they actually enrolled in First Steps? So if and the reason I say that is if children are enrolled in First Steps long before 18 months, then there's lots of opportunity, one, for that relationship building, and two, for that second level screening to happen. If they're referred to First Steps at 30 months of age, there's not a lot of room there to do anything. And so that sort of knowledge about how children who really do have later diagnoses of autism, knowing when and how they're enrolled in its First Steps, might help inform recommendations.
I think that's where the 50% rule bites us, because it's hard to demonstrate that 50% delay the younger the child is, right?
It
So-
is, but I can tell you, it's been a minute since I looked at this, but some data around that. The last time we looked at this, the average age of diagnosis for autism, and again, this was right at pandemic, so it's a couple of years old, it's 24 months in our system for the children that had a diagnosis of autism, and we were serving them. That referral came at around 24 months, and we had
Yeah,
about
that's the-
60.
Those are meaning for children in
So
First Steps.
for
or
children
diagnosis?
in First Steps with the reason they qualified being a diagnosis of autism, and there was around 65 to 70 children in the program. And again, this is a couple of years old, but we could pull this again. And that average referral to our program age and getting services started was give or take 24 months.
That's important
now-
information, but I think
and
the
I wanted to
question I was
add,
asked is a
though-
little different.
Well, I wanted
which
to
is-
add,
Yeah, sorry, go
I
ahead.
just wanted to add to that, the number of children receiving ABA, which means they have significant behaviors. They don't have to have a diagnosis of autism to get ABA and First Steps, but they have to have significant behaviors, was over 200 children. So I think that kind of gets to John's comment that, and Carrie's comment, they're coming in under developmental delay, because I'm gonna guess that 140 children there in that gap is likely they probably will end up at some point in time.
And I think that's the ones that Steve was talking about, are the ones who are coming into First Steps without a diagnosis. And maybe trying to come up with, it would have to be looking backwards, but trying to come up with when did those kids who are getting ABA come into First Steps? Was it at 30 months or 18 months or 12 months kind of thing?
Yeah, my question was sort of that's important information, Pam, but I think my question was sort of the looking backward question, which actually we have data on through our Autism Center data collection, because for the kids who are making diagnoses on, there is a question on the sheet, at least the sheets that I fill out, which is, did this child have First Steps?
Yeah, that's been a concern in the past, and that's what generated that data point in our collective reporting.
But if Pam and through First Steps have data on the kids in First Steps that have ABA, that's probably the population you're wanting to target with potentially somehow can we collaborate and work together and refer for autism specific screening for children in First Steps who are receiving ABA.
Yeah, we can do aggregate. We can't obviously do
Right,
PII, but we could do aggregate.
And I think that's relevant. The other point is that, and I don't have quantitative numbers on this, but qualitatively, I can tell you that there is a minority of children who don't meet First Steps requirements for service, legitimately so. They were evaluated, parent referred, doc referred, whomever. They were evaluated, they don't meet developmental delay criteria, and therefore they don't qualify for services. And they show up in our office 6 months later, and we know they have autism from them being in the waiting room, right? So those are kids that we also have concerns about. And it's not a criticism of all the good work that First Steps does. It simply says that there are a couple ways that you can escape detection there.
Absolutely.
And those are things that we'd like to tighten up if possible. What I say to every family I diagnose with a young child is I say, autism is fundamentally not a developmental delay. It is a developmental difference. It is not that your child is slower in getting somewhere, although he or she certainly may be slower in getting somewhere. It's that they are going on a different path. And people really get that makes sense to them. And I can say, so your child didn't qualify for developmental delay criteria, and truthfully, that was correct. I'm not criticizing that. It's just that the tools used are sensitive to the qualitative impairments of those children. Now, that's not the majority of children, but it is, maybe it's 25%.
Yeah.
But the
all right.
kids I'm thinking about are, let's say the median age of diagnosis of autism is, I don't know what it is, but 3 to 4 years of age, let's say 4. That means 50% of the kids are diagnosed later. So if those kids diagnosed later, if we want to screen more effectively for them, and we think that First Steps is the place to do that. If they never achieve eligibility for First Steps, then it's not the place to screen for them. So we want to know about, where would we encounter children? Would that be in First Steps or in some other setting? So knowing how many actually receive First Steps would be informative for our efforts.
And we can do data analysis in our system. I can tell you how many pediatricians are doing regular MChats because we've got records on that. We know within Mercy, which is just one system across a big state, but we can give you data on that. And the answer to your question is if they're missed in First Steps, they're supposed to be picked up in their primary care medical office. And some get missed in both places, right? And that's going to happen. And I don't want to lose sight of the fact that parents and families need to be driving this bus. The worst thing you can do is start answering questions that aren't being asked, because then your relationship is gone. Absolutely. So you've got to meet people where they are, and they've got to be in charge. But in order to be in charge, they've got to have informed decision opportunities. And that's something we can work on.
John, I'm going to step off. But
Thanks for all this.
Thank you for letting me join from afar, and I will follow up when I return.
Enjoy the meeting.
I have to
Thank
run
you very
to
much.
in a completely different place and way than Steve.
Yeah, you couldn't join his meeting at the moment.
Let me know if there's anything you need.
Yeah, and Kristen will be circling back, and we'll be getting some work groups together to further this discussion.
Thank you so much for the time today. I really appreciate it. I'm happy to send out some links to things we talked about. Just let me know.
Thank you, Pam. All right, so we're going to come into the closing time frame here. So I'd like to hear from people any comments or thoughts or questions that they might have in terms of more focused on where we're going next, but on any topic of your choice. Clearly, over the next 3 months, we're going to be working through this process that was initiated here today. Other thoughts or things that we need to be talking about? All right, well, thanks everybody for your participation. Our next meeting is July 7th. No, July 27th. Yes, July 27th. So same time, same place. We'll send out announcements about that. I guess the question will evolve and people will let us know on this particular topic. This is a more focused topic. I think everybody has something to say about transition to adulthood because everybody has a piece of that elephant. This one is a little bit more specific in terms of your own involvement with that. Some of us very involved, some others perhaps not as relevant. So, but I want to invite everybody to participate because very often the person who's not living and thinking about it every day doesn't make the same mistakes that the people who are doing it every day are making. And saying, well, have you guys thought about this? Because I see kids when they're 20 and it looks to me like this stuff got missed when they were 4. Those topics I think are really useful. Or what are we missing about opportunities to work more closely and partner more closely with families and to communicate more effectively and to build capacities within families for their own role in working with and parenting and at the same time working with their child's special issues. So I think, and those things are not specific to being the one in the diagnostic room. Those are bigger topics. So please reach out with any thoughts or comments that you have. Kristen, you have anything else?
No. I will ask that you all double check your credentials on that transition report and email me if there's any inaccuracies on that. And then, like John said, we will be in touch with work group schedules and all that after Pam and Steve get a chance to collaborate. So,
Carrie, anything? Okay, great. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for being here and thanks for being online.
Thank you.